clicking live. Hey, folks, it's your buddy Mike Messier. It's a Friday night. I'm here in Jacksonville, Florida. My buddy Jimmy Faluca is in Staten Island. Is that correct, Jimmy?
That is correct. That is where I am.
And Jimmy, this is going to be a very special conversation. We're talking about one of your favorite wrestlers, one of my favorite wrestlers, a guy that I have a lot of respect for. I know that you have the esteemed respect for him. Why don't you tell the audience here who we're talking about tonight?
Well, tonight's subject of conversation here with my good friend Mikey Messier is the one and only Undertaker. Um, Considered by many the greatest character in the history of wrestling. In my humble opinion, he's the greatest character I've ever seen. Um, I have several reasons why I believe that, and a lot of my favorite characters, and I've said this many times before, a lot of my favorite characters, for whatever reason, are derived from darkness. Whether
Okay.
it's Count Dracula, Darth Vader, Batman, the Crow, uh, the Shadow, all of my favorite characters have that air of darkness about them. But if I was to put one above all of them, it would be The Undertaker. And just looking at him, looking at the character in a vacuum, he was a character that it's a massive oxymoron. He was constantly changing, but he never betrayed the core of his character. He he was a constant in professional wrestling. And even if you weren't a huge WWF fan, which I can tell you I know many people that weren't, that preferred WCW. They preferred the NWA. But they knew him, and the word that you're going to hear constantly brought up when it comes to this man is respect. No one, to the best of my knowledge, since the late Andre the Giant, has had that air of mystique and respect as Mark Calaway. And the evolving of his character over the course of his 30 years, the constantly having incredible rivalries with multiple characters of various shapes and sizes, it's a testament to him. Now, to be fair, he did have the support of the brand, which you need to a degree to reach a certain level. I think most people would admit that.
The brand
However,
being the brand
how
being WWE, just to put that in
yes,
there.
yes, but you also have to deliver in your performance. You could get as many opportunities as possible, but if your audience doesn't buy into you, it's kind of an empty celebration. That's not the case with the Undertaker, because from day one this guy got it. He bought into his character. And I don't see very many people do that these days outside of the late Bray Wyatt and MJF. These are guys that actually buy into their characters. They are the character full time, whether they're doing an interview outside the business or whether they're at an event or they're in front of the camera. These are people that live who they are. Uh, Undertaker is my all time favorite wrestler. He has been since the first time I laid eyes on him in Madison Square Garden when I was 3 years old. I'll never forget it. My dad took me to a show. See, because my father, and I mentioned this on a previous show, my
Yep.
father used to do security for the handicap because he worked for the Department of Sanitation and there was a connection there. So they told him, listen, help out with the kids and you sit back and you watch the show. He's like, yeah, I don't mind, no problem. And at one point, the guy told him, bring your son. He might have fun. So my dad brought me and my grandfather, his father-in-law, along because he had to tend to the kids. So someone had to sit with, 3-year-old
Sure.
me. And my dad told me, you're going to see a lot of guys that come out to fight. I have a feeling you're going to like a couple of them. One of them was the Macho Man Randy Savage, which, I mean, anyone who had the pleasure of seeing the Macho Man
Yeah.
it was just an experience. And then the lights went out. The bell tolled. And I saw this figure walking slowly up the ramp. The arena was dark. He gets into the ring and he had a promo segment. I don't remember the specifics of the promo. All I remember was just being in awe of him. And then the music went off and he started walking back. Now, for those of you that watched back then, Undertaker was never seen smacking hands with the fans. That just wasn't his thing. But this was a live event, so there were no cameras. So he was. And I stuck my hand out and he shook my hand. And that gave birth to a fandom of over 30 years. And this is the Polaroid picture that I took of The Undertaker in Madison Square Garden when I was a kid. The reason you see it's all water damage is because we got hit by Sandy. And I almost lost this picture completely, but I was able to salvage it.
I think you've got to get that scanned into a computer and send it off to Office Max or Staples or something like that to get it enlarged.
If that's at all possible, I would be overjoyed to do that.
Yeah, all you need is a printer that has a scanner on it. Hook it up to your computer, and then email it to Staples, Office Max, or even UPS. UPS stores typically can print large size color, and it's not that expensive either. So
wow,
I would encourage you to do that.
That character made me Macho Man made me aware of wrestling. Undertaker made me love it. And having had the pleasure of meeting him on 2 different occasions, the first time I met him was courtesy of my wife. She got me a ticket to Wizard World. She came with me, of course, in Chicago, Illinois, to meet him.
Right.
It was at a convention called Wizard World. It was like a comic book convention, and he was doing a signing there. And when I met him and I made eye contact with him, I shook his hand. We took a photograph together, which I was clearly overjoyed.
There you go.
Getting to meet him. I told him I loved his shirt because I love Elvis Presley and I love Ali.
Let's see that picture again. Put the picture back up while you talk about it.
Sure.
Oh, he's got, who's on his shirt? Is that
Muhammad Ali and Elvis Presley?
Okay, cool. And what's on
I
your
happen
shirt?
I happen to love Elvis Presley, and
yeah,
I have a certain respect for Muhammad Ali as an athlete.
Sure.
Then we got to the line to do autographs, which I was on, and I saw the late Timmy White there, the referee.
Yes.
Now, I had met Timmy White on multiple occasions before, and so he knew me, which was cool. So he looks up at me and says, "Hey, Jim, how's it going, bud?" First of all, I was happy he remembered me from the amount of times we met. And, I told him, I says, "Tim, I got to tell you, you're a lucky guy." And he says, "Yes, I am. This is my life now. I get to travel with that." I says, "No, you're lucky because you get to stand next to him." Not realizing he was listening, and he looked over at me and I froze. So then he started talking to me.
Undertaker
and I told him that he was a large reason why I had a good childhood. I had an incredible family. But my reward for behaving, doing good in school, the things that, kids behave themselves for a reward. My reward was Monday nights, getting to watch him, getting to watch the pay-per-views, getting to watch his matches. And then I showed him the picture that I showed you guys.
Yep.
And I handed it to him. I said, "I took this picture of you in Madison Square Garden in 1993. And you shook my hand on your way back through the curtain." I said, "From that day forward, I never missed a show." He took the picture in his hand. He's like, "Well, I'll be." And he looked at it for like a good 2 minutes. And I told him, when I realized how long ago, he's like, "Yeah, you kept this picture all this time?" I looked at him and I said, "Aside from my father, you were my hero when I was a kid." You were who I looked up to. And what was cool is he didn't know how to respond to that. I said, you don't get it. I said, I says, you're a very intelligent man, but I don't think you comprehend what you mean to everyone that's here. The line was, I can't tell you how long it was to meet him. I says, you mean so much to so many people. I don't think you'll ever understand. It says, why do you think there were grown men crying in New Orleans when you lost?
Right.
And I said, I don't know if you thought it wasn't a big deal, but it was a big deal to us because none of us wanted to see that. And he really didn't answer me for that. Years later, he had the Austin podcast and he said that Brock didn't need it. And that was validation for me because even he knew it shouldn't have happened. And if it was going to happen, it should have been for the next big star, not someone who was established. And from what I heard, even Brock Lesnar didn't want it.
Yeah.
Because Undertaker are friends. But
Yeah.
before I left, before he and I parted ways, I told him, I says, listen, I don't care how many tickets Hogan sold. I don't care how many t-shirts Austin sold. And I don't care how many movies The Rock was in. For me, you're the greatest wrestler I ever saw in my life. And I just want you to know this was for you. This is a tattoo of the Grim Reaper.
Yep.
On a throne.
Yeah.
And his shield, you can see it.
Oh, yeah.
Has the Taker symbol. He touched my arm. He looked at it. He said, man, that's the coolest shit I've ever seen. How long was your session? Because as you can tell, he's been tatted up a few times. It was about 4 hours, but it was worth it. Yeah. And he sat back laughing. And then he stood up, all 6'11" of him, and he stuck his hand out to me. He says, thank you, brother. I shook his hand. I walked away, and I started bawling like a baby. And the worst part is my wife has it on camera.
I think that's the best part. I mean, you were almost inducted into what was it called, the Bone Street Crew? What was this?
Yo, please.
Was that?
I'll tell you this: if I see Godfather at Comic-Con next week, when I'm dressed as him, I might get that induction.
Yeah. Buy him a few rounds. Well, let me go back to one of the things you said earlier, and that's great stuff, Jimmy. Great stories. You mentioned, and I was thinking about this today, and I think I've had this thought before, but never spoke about it. But I think like they've called Mark Callis, the Undertaker, the locker room leader for most of his WWE run. He's been there since Survivor Series 1990. He did have a career before that, and we'll get to talking about that too. But he's been called the locker room leader for many, many years, decades at this point. And I feel in some way he kind of inherited that position from Andre the Giant. I mean, I think with Andre, it might have been, the word might have been fear more so than with Undertaker. I think it was respect. I think a lot of guys, just from the stories we've picked up from listening to the wrestler shoot interviews and from the wrestlers that I've talked to in person, that Andre was always kind of, he either loved you or hated you. And he would sit there playing cards. And if Andre wanted you to play cards, you'd play cards with him.
Sit here, boss. Sergeant Slaughter told that story several times.
Yeah. And I feel like there was a couple of guys, apparently he wasn't at times too fond of Big John Studd. Initially he wasn't too fond of Hulk Hogan. And, but I think there were guys that, Roddy Piper seems to think that Andre really liked him, Piper. And, interesting stuff. But I think when Andre was kind of near the end of his run, both his career and his life, unfortunately, because Undertaker came in at Survivor Series 90. I think Andre, his last big match in WWF, I think was WrestleMania 6 with the Colossal Connection, him and Haku losing the tag belts. And I think Andre's last match was December 4th, 1992 in Japan. He was in a tag team match, I believe, with Giant Baba. And that was Andre's last match. So Andre was kind of phasing out as Undertaker was on the rise. And in my opinion, not being there, but being on the outside looking in, I kind of feel like Undertaker took that boss, like the big boss spot, you know what I mean? Not the big boss man, but the big boss spot in the dressing room of the WWF. And I think he was firmly established. And you told the story a couple of episodes ago or a couple of podcasts ago about the the time that the Undertaker at WrestleMania 14, the concern was that Shawn Michaels, with his injured back and his on again, off again smile, may not want to put Steve Austin over 1, 2, 3 in the middle of the ring, and the Undertaker was seen by many rolling up the fist on his
Taping up
rolling up
his
the
fist at the gorilla position, sat there for the whole match, and once it was over, he took his tape off, went and changed.
and that
Austin told
was
that story. Cornette told that story, and Taker finally admitted it on his second episode with Steve Austin, where he told Shawn that it didn't happen because him and Shawn became friends in later years.
right.
But back in those days, he did not care for Shawn Michaels because he felt that Shawn was a shit stirrer. And while he may never admit this out in the open, I firmly believe The Undertaker blames Shawn Michaels for what happened in Montreal as much as Vince, because that whole back and forth between Shawn and Brett, where Brett didn't want to lose to him, came from Shawn telling him to his face, "I'm glad you want to put me over, but I'm not willing to do the same for you." He said that in front of Jim Neidhart, and Brett's then like, "Really? He said that to me? I'm not working with this guy." And in retrospect, Brett was right, and Taker, was friends with Brett. He understood, and that's where a lot of that vitriol came from. Taker had no problem working with Shawn. He said many times Shawn could have a great match with a broomstick. Of course, he and I are going to do just fine.
Yeah.
But personally, he did not care for Shawn because he felt that Shawn had his own agenda, and he did. Let's be frank, he did. You mentioned Hogan he didn't care for. No, he didn't care for Hogan after Survivor Series 91 because Hogan faked an injury.
Right.
When Hogan went backstage, he collapsed, and Hogan went to the hospital, and Vince went with him. And Taker didn't find out till years later. Apparently, he was, talking to some of the younger guys, telling them to be careful because look what happened with me. I hurt Hogan. And then apparently it was Brian Adams' crush who turned around and told him, "You didn't hurt Hogan." And Taker's like, "What are you talking about?" Showed him the tape.
Right.
And he sees what the rest of us see. Hogan's head never even touched the chair. When Taker found out, he was pissed because that could have had a negative it didn't, but it potentially could have had a negative impact on Taker's career that he hurt the so-called golden goose. So I don't know what Hogan was thinking doing that, but that's where Taker did not have good feelings for Hogan at all. And
I think
you can understand why. Hogan was trying to cut his legs out from under him.
yeah, that's what it was. And ironically enough, Jimmy, Hogan, I'm not sure if he was in charge of casting or what, but Mark Callis, before he was even the Undertaker, was cast in a Hogan movie.
Suburban
Not one,
Commando.
yes, which I still haven't seen the whole thing, by the way.
Me
But I've
neither.
seen
I've
clips.
never seen the movie at all.
But the point is that it's interesting that Hogan, whether he directly casted Callis in that movie or at least didn't reject him somehow, and that also, along with the recommendations of Paul Heyman, um, Bruce Pritchard takes some credit for introducing Mark Callis to Vince McMahon because they were pushing for him, and Dutch Mantel deserves some credit because he
Yes.
was the one that suggested Mark Callis to go to WCW along with Terry Funk, I believe. I think Terry Funk, put the good word in for Mark Callis. I believe the story goes that Terry Funk was the guy that said, "Mark Calaway, why don't you call him Mark Callis like he's callous?" So there's a lot of people.
Oh, I love your Terry Funk impression.
It's a new one. It's a new one. So I think a lot of guys,
They played a part in his life. They played a part.
Yeah,
Terry played a part in getting his name right. Dirty Dutch had a hand in getting him to WCW where the money was being made. Paul Heyman was the one that brokered the deal with Vince because Paul was apparently in the room when Ole Anderson, there's that guy again, Ole Anderson, turned around and said, "This big, dumb, redheaded son of a bitch will never draw any money."
Right.
With Taker standing right there. So he put feelers out to Vince, say, "Listen, there's a guy here that's 6'10", 300 pounds, moves like a cat. He's gonna be future endeavored soon. You might want to pick him up." And think about this. back then, when he was Mean Mark Callis, Taker was walking the top rope, old
Right.
school, was doing flying clotheslines, and to quote Paul Heyman, he said the fact that he wasn't already at the top of WCW scared him because the guy had it. He had the athleticism, he had size, and he was reliable. You knew you could depend on him. If you needed him to be somewhere, you didn't have to worry about Mark showing up drunk or high. You didn't have to worry about him no showing or demanding more money. Mark was all about business. So when Vince gave him the opportunity with the Undertaker character, he ran with it. And then you mentioned Bruce Pritchard.
Right.
Bruce Pritchard was instrumental because Undertaker wasn't a character that should have been doing a lot of talking. Granted, at the beginning he did a little bit, but Bruce Pritchard, Brother Love, did the gist of the interviews. And then we get to, in my book, probably one of, next to Vince, the most important aspect to The Undertaker being a success. Paul Bearer. To me, the most underrated manager of all time. You talk about the all-time great managers. You're talking about the Grand Wizard. You're talking about Lou Albano. You're talking about Bobby the Brain Heenan. You're talking about Gary Hart, Jimmy Hart, Jim Cornette, Paul Heyman. Paul Bearer is one of those guys as well because he was the catalyst for three important characters for the WWF. The Undertaker, Mankind, and Kane. Without Paul Bearer, those three characters would have had an uphill battle communicating with the audience because they were characters that shouldn't have been doing a lot of talking. Now, granted, Mankind did his fair share of the interviews, but Paul Bearer provided instant credibility for Mankind because remember, Mick Foley wasn't allowed to be Cactus Jack, the name that he had established both in Japan and on the independent circuit for years. He had to start fresh. And Paul Bearer gave him that stamp of approval. But to me, the Paul Bearer and Undertaker pairing, it's got to be one of the best manager-wrestler combinations ever, whether it's Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth, Brock Lesnar and Paul Heyman. Undertaker and Paul Bearer, to me, go hand in hand. And I felt they were such a great duo. And the fact that Paul was a licensed mortician, legitimately, just added to it. I mean, what are the odds that Paul Bearer is a legitimate Undertaker? You know?
Well, yeah, we've got a comment here, and this might, I'm not sure who the commenter is. It could be anybody, but I think I know who it is. Just so you know, guys, if you go over to the YouTube page, One Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan, you can comment and we'll actually see your name. If you want to remain anonymous, go ahead and do what you're doing. The Undertaker is definitely one of the greatest, if not the greatest, gimmicks of all time. Let me jump in on some of the stuff you're saying about the Paul Bearer Undertaker connection. I knew this little fact of trivia, but I forgot it until today. The Undertaker, Mark Calaway's first pro wrestling match in an actual ring was in World Class Championship Wrestling. They were kind of on the tail end of that company, but they still had a decent following. It was June 26, 1987, at the Dallas Sportatorium, where we had all those Von Erich Freebirds matches, the Missing Link, Kamala, all those legends. I mean, Flair was there many times.
Ravishing Rick Rude.
Yep. So June 26, 1987, under a mask and wrestling as Texas Red, he goes into his first match. In his corner is Percy Pringle III, who would become Paul Bearer.
Yes.
About 3.5 years later. And the opponent, do you know who the opponent was, Jimmy?
Oh, I know exactly who the opponent was. The late, great Frank Goodish, a.k.a. Bruiser Brody. And the only reason that they had Percy at ringside with Mark was to guide him to the back because Frank kicked the shit out of him all over that sportatorium.
Yeah, the match. I've watched the match. It's not that long. I mean, but what I find interesting about it, Jimmy, is that Texas Red is not even. He's not. I mean, first of all, he's got a manager, so he's not necessarily a job guy. Like he's not going in there as a squash guy. He's going in there as a legitimate opponent. And from what I remember of the match, it's not long, but Brody does win clean, but the Texas Red is kind of off the bat established as a legitimate opponent. You know what I mean? Like he's got a gimmick, he's got a name, he's in
And he
great
has a
shape,
manager with
and
with
he's
name recognition at that time.
right. So I mean, Percy Pringle had been the manager of Ravishing Rick Rude, who was their, in their eyes, their world champion. And Percy Pringle had not wrestled, but he had been a manager of guys like Jesse Barr in Florida, Rick Rude again in Florida, Hercules Hernandez. Percy Pringle, I believe he had managed a tag team called the Zambui Express, which was the tag team that inspired New Jack of the Gangsters to be a wrestler. So Percy Pringle actually, like Mark Callis, Percy Pringle had a career pre WWF. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that now. I'm old enough to remember the Mean Mark Callis days. And to me, it was very interesting. The first time I can remember seeing Mark Callis, I mean, I remember hearing little bits and pieces about, you know, he had a couple of different names in the territories, like CWA, which is basically Memphis wrestling. He was called the
Mm-hmm.
Master of Pain. Texas, he was called Texas Red or Texas Red Jack. I do remember watching, I was a big NWA fan. It was technically WCW in 1990, but they still called it the NWA. It was a little bit
Yeah.
off kilter because they hadn't officially legally changed their name to World Championship Wrestling. But basically, there was this really monster tag team of Dangerous Danny Spivey and Sid Vicious. They were called the Skyscrapers.
Mm-hmm. They were
As
managed by Teddy Long, I believe.
you are correct, sir. And I saw them win the 2-ring battle royal at the Great American Bash '89. That's Sid and Danny with Teddy Long, and that's the Flair Funk pay-per-view. That was the undercard, and they also defeated the Dynamic Dudes of Johnny Ace and Shane Douglas on that show. So the Skyscrapers were a big deal. They were feuding with the Legion of Doom, the Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal.
Mm-hmm.
They had
Chicago
even
Street Fight.
Yep, they had even gotten the better of them on a few occasions. In fact, the Skyscrapers were scheduled to be at Starrcade '89, they had this really interesting 4 tag team a round robin tournament, which they never did before in the States, and a 4-person singles tournament. So they had scheduled the Skyscrapers, the Road Warriors, the Steiners, and the Samoan SWAT team, which would later be Rikishi and the Tonga Kid, I believe. So in that tournament, they were hyping it up with a Clash of the Champions in November of 1989. And in a melee, the Steiners versus the Skyscrapers of Sid and Danny, Scott Steiner apparently hit Sid with the clothesline to the chest, and it punctured Sid's lung, and Sid was out of action. So the Skyscrapers did not compete at that show. A few weeks later at Starrcade '89, they were replaced by Doom. And where I'm headed with all of this is that they didn't want to give up, you know, the IP or the gimmick or the name of the Skyscrapers. WCW really liked that name, but Sid was definitely going to be out for a while. So
So they
they did
needed
what
an adequate replacement who had similar stature.
correct. And they got a guy who had never been on national television before, except maybe one of his world class matches hit ESPN. But the guy that they got, and I believe it was someone it might have been Jim Cornette at WCW, that they called to Dutch Mantel to ask, hey, we need a tall guy to join the Skyscrapers. And that's when Dutch, you know, he knew that they had this Mark Callis guy, but he also knew, in fairness to Mark, we can't pay here in Memphis
What they can pay
the
in WCW.
right. So Dutch, being a professional, looking out for the other boys, did not want to hold this young guy back. He knew that Memphis was short with the money. So he basically recommended Mark Callis. I guess they looked at a couple of VHS tapes or whatever. They had no internet at the time.
Nope.
And Mark Callis was basically hired and put, once again, Jimmy, I mean, his first match against Bruiser Brody and his first national angle as part of this tag team as a substitute for Sid Vicious And by 1989, Sid Vicious was very popular in wrestling. He had
Yeah,
been,
he was.
he was a big name, right? So they put Mark Callis in the spot, and they call him Mean Mark Callis. He did not have the ripped physique of Sid, but once you started watching this guy wrestle, it's like this guy can really wrestle. And
Hmm.
and I don't know if you've seen this match, Jimmy, or not, but there's a match some point, it must have been early 1990, of the new Skyscrapers, Mean Mark and Dangerous Dan, still with Teddy Long. They're taking on the Road Warriors, and it's a really, really, really good match. And you see that this new version of the Skyscrapers, of Danny and Mark, in a way, they're a better fit because, like I said, Mark Callis was in great shape, but he didn't have that super ripped physique like Sid did.
And he
So
made up for it with his athleticism.
right, and he complimented Dan, I think, a lot better because when you had the Sid and Danny Spivey, and Danny Spivey kind of had his lanky but kind of fleshy build, it made Dan look like the weak link. But with Mark, who had those big shoulders, but he had more of a basketball player build almost, it looked like him and Dan really gelled better visually, in my opinion, superior to Sid and Dan. And they were off to the races. And now here's another obstacle for Mark Callis. They were scheduled for a big pay-per-view match at Wrestle War 1990, which was the same night that Lex Luger had to take Sting's place against Ric Flair because Sting had the knee injury. And Danny Spivey did something that was really unprofessional. He did not show up. He did not show up for a pay-per-view match. To me, that's really a bad move on Spivey's part. And he basically left this new guy, Mark Callis, on his
Holding the bag.
own, holding the bag as a skyscraper against the two Road Warriors. And you got to remember, folks, the Road Warriors had been the dominant tag team in wrestling for going on 6 or 7 years at this point. So this was a big deal for the Skyscrapers. Granted, they were probably going to lose, but so
But
what? I
still,
mean,
at that
right,
time, to be in a street fight with the Road Warriors, that meant you were a big deal because they weren't going on pay-per-view and selling for nobody.
right.
They weren't going to sell for nobodies. So if they were selling for you, that meant you were somebody. And that, like you said, was an opportunity for Mark. And I believe Mark told the story that Dan Spivey was not vibing with the people who ran WCW back then, aka Jim Herd, which we've heard everyone from Flair to Cornette that have all had problems with this guy. I mean, when that many people have problems with you,
Right.
but still, like you said, Spivey probably should have showed up and not left Mark holding the bag. But because that happened, it left Mark on his own, and then he ended up becoming under the tutelage of Paul Heyman. And that's where Paul started to work with him a bit. And Paul was enamored with the guy. He's like, look at him.
Yeah.
He's a monster. He can move. He can talk. He's got a great look. How is he not one of our top stars? And that's where Ole Anderson dropped the line, this big redheaded dumb son of a bitch will never draw any money. And that's where Mark saw the writing on the wall and that his days in WCW were numbered.
Yeah, and at that Wrestle War match, they threw Mike Enos from the Destruction Crew and later the Beverly Brothers. They threw Mike Enos under a mask, and he took the Dan Spivey spot in that match. And you're right. By the summertime, Mean Mark Callis, with Paul Heyman as his manager, was listed as the #1 contender to Lex Luger's U.S. Heavyweight title. And you had asked me that question you asked me before we went on the air that you were going to ask on the show,
Yeah.
because I haven't given you
When
an answer yet.
did you know that The Undertaker was going to be a mainstay in pro wrestling? When did you say this guy's going to be something?
As a young kid, I had gone to the 88 Great American Bash pay-per-view in Baltimore in 88 and in 89. In 1990, I did not go in live time, but we had a party to watch it, and we had a lot of fun. And this was, just a 3-hour standard NWA pay-per-view, which had a lot of great matches. The Rock and Roll Express had come back to Wrestle Doom. And of course, the big match was Sting versus Ric Flair. They had a preliminary match of Mike Rotundo versus the Iron Sheik. They had another prelim match of Harley Race versus Tommy Rich in a battle of former champions. But on the build-up to the main event of Sting versus Flair, there was a really good U.S. title match. And the U.S. title match was Lex Luger, the champion, as a babyface, defending the title against Mean Mark Callis. And I'll get into the stuff I've learned about this match after. But as a fan, as a young guy watching this match, I was really impressed with Mark Callis, and he had me thinking he was going to win the title from Luger, and I was hoping he was going to win the title from Luger because to me, this was one of Luger's best matches. And even as a young wrestling fan, you kind of knew that some guys, as far as the actual in-ring stuff, Luger could have good matches, and he
He
did when
could,
he was
with the right
yeah,
opponent. With the
with
right
the
opponent, he
right.
could.
With the right opponent, and the right opponent traditionally meant he had to be in there with Flair or Barry Windham
Or Sting,
or Sting. And so I'm thinking as a young
or
kind of smart
Steamboat.
right, exactly. And I'm thinking as a young smart fan, well, this Mean Mark Callis guy, he's pretty new. And Luger's not going to be able to be that ring general like Flair or Sting
And
or
the match
Steamboat.
ended up being not half bad.
I thought it was really good. And I thought on a card, like I said, that you had Flair, Sting, Rock and Roll Express, Doom. This is the show that had that big Midnight Express Southern Boys match that people still rave about 30 years later. I think that Mark Callis made a good impression. Now, here's the irony, Jimmy. I've heard from Bruce Pritchard's podcast, Something to Wrestle With years later, that this was the trial match of sorts for Mark Callis to go to WWF because this was a match on pay-per-view television. I believe it was his first singles match on pay-per-view. So that Bruce was going to show this to Vince McMahon, and then Mark Callis himself did not feel good about this match because he went into a match apparently with an injured shoulder, and he didn't feel that he had a really good match with Luger. And of course, he was going to lose anyway, but he didn't feel that he performed to the best of his abilities. And he was like, "Don't show that match to Vince. Don't show that." And I think the way that Pritchard tells the story, Vince McMahon saw the match regardless, and he wasn't that impressed. But Pritchard, kind of convinced him, "Hey, that's because he was wrestling Luger." So to me, it's just an interesting thing that a match as a fan, Jimmy, I really thought was quite good. According to these professionals in the business, Bruce Pritchard, Vince McMahon, and Mean Mark or the Undertaker himself, it wasn't that good a match. But it's
I
just
got this. I got a similar response from Mick Foley when I told him that my favorite match with him and the Undertaker was their match at the Survivor Series in Madison Square Garden, 1996. As far as a match, from bell to bell, it was awesome. And he told me last year that he felt that he and Taker lost a step that night. I told him, I said, well, I'm very sorry you feel that way because from the time that bell rang to the time you got dropped with the tombstone, I was on the edge of my chair for that entire match. And I believe that was the match where Paul Bear was hanging in a shark cage above the ring. But
oh yeah,
that's getting ahead. But yeah, he had a pretty damn good match with Luger. And he was on his way to the WWF, and he knew that was the land of the gimmicks. He didn't know what he was going to be stuck with. And then he gets the phone call, is this the Undertaker? Undertaker. Yep. I'm the Undertaker. And they showed on one of the documentaries sketches of what they envisioned the Undertaker character looking like. And it's that basic Western mortician look. The long black coat, the black hat, the long rubber gloves because you have to embalm the body, and
right.
the spats. That was the look they were going for. And I tell you something. To this day, I wish he would have worn that original attire one more time in his run before his career ended. The last time The Undertaker wore that garb, the tie, the gloves, the boot covers, the last time he wore that was WrestleMania 13 when he ironically faced the champion, Psycho Sid Vicious.
Yes.
And I don't know about you, but that original look of The Undertaker with the tie, the gloves, the boot covers, that always stuck with me. Like, maybe because it's the first thing we saw of him when Ted DiBiase introduced him. But let me tell you something. You know who also deserves credit for help getting the Undertaker character over that not enough people talk about? Gorilla Monsoon.
Ah,
And the reason I say that is because whether the Undertaker was playing the villain or the anti-hero, Gorilla Monsoon went out of his way to hammer home just how athletic and just how good Undertaker was. You know, I believe Jim Cornette said it perfectly. You know, Steve Austin's job in the Attitude Era was to get himself over. The Rock's job was to get himself over. JR's job was to get everybody over.
right.
So your announcers are the bridge between the fans and the talent. And Gorilla Monsoon did a really, really good job that he doesn't get enough credit for, God rest his soul, for getting The Undertaker over. JR would eventually take over when Gorilla stepped away from the booth.
Right.
And, you know, especially as those early 90s went by, the feuds with Jimmy Snuka, the feuds with Jake the Snake Roberts, the feud with Hulk Hogan where he won his first title a year to the day that he debuted. Then, of course, my favorite rivalry of that era with him, the rivalry with Yokozuna. I mean, again, I think all Samoans are born just knowing how to wrestle. Unless your name is Nia Jax. No disrespect intended, but I have to be honest. I'm
She
sorry.
stinks. Yeah.
Just no.
Yeah. She's
But
reckless.
but the feud Undertaker had with Yokozuna was just, to me, was some of his best work from the early days. And Yokozuna and him just had incredible chemistry that whenever they wrestled, they just clicked. It just worked. And Yokozuna was very good. I have to give credit to Yokozuna for his facial expressions and selling the fear of the Undertaker, the fear of the casket.
Yep.
The whole package with him and Jim Cornette and Mr. Fuji, I thought was brilliant because Fuji couldn't really verbalize as well as Cornette could. But Fuji provided that devious, sneaky manager, the foreign manager. I just thought Fuji was brilliant. I thought he was brilliant when he managed the Demolition. But with Yokozuna, to me, it was even better because it was at the heavyweight championship level. And I thought that Taker's feud with Yokozuna was important because it solidified The Undertaker as a babyface going forward. Because if you remember, they had the big casket match at the Royal Rumble where it took 10 of the top heels coming out to bludgeon The Undertaker into oblivion, throw him in the casket, nail it shut, and when they're bringing the casket away, the lights go out and The Undertaker delivers his first great promo where he talks about how The Undertaker's spirit will be reborn, that he will never rest in peace. Then the image of him in the casket explodes. He raises up to the heavens, and then Marty Jannetty in the Undertaker gimmick goes up on the zip line. I remember seeing that, being mad that he lost,
Right.
and then seeing, I'll never forget as long as I live, that the image of him in the casket appears and his eyes are shut. He's dead. And then the gong goes off and his head snaps and he looks at the camera. And I'm like, oh my God, he's alive. As a 4-year-old, that's incredible. Now, I'm sure as a big NWA fan, you appreciated more the Barry Windhams, the Magnum TAs, the Ricky Steamboats. But as a fan, be honest. What are you thinking when you're seeing stuff like this happening?
You know, it's funny. That was a time when I was actually in college. And so I did not have access to that Royal Rumble 1994. Now, after the fact, Jimmy, I can tell you that I lived in Providence, Rhode Island for many years, and that Royal Rumble was a pay-per-view out of Providence, Rhode Island.
Hmm.
And the fans and the friends that I made in Rhode Island, many years after that match, we're still talking about it. That's one of the, I mean, that and Jake the Snake Roberts DDTing Ricky Steamboat on a Saturday night's main event, that took place in the same arena, the Providence Civic Center.
Hmm. And
And
Jake warned him,
Providence,
don't let me do that because it's going to hurt him. And
right,
sure enough,
right.
it did.
Yeah. So those two things, from my experience, have been what Providence, Rhode Island wrestling fans who went to the WWF shows in the arena, Providence Civic Center is what they call it. Now it's called the Dunkin' Donuts Center. But they always talk about, it's usually the Undertaker situation first. That's usually what comes up because it left such an impression. And for me, Jimmy, at that time, I had kind of accepted like these two companies do things a little bit differently than
Hmm.
each other. But also, you got to remember the WCW was starting to go more towards the WWF way of doing things, with things like the White Castle of Fear vignette, and they had done the spin the wheel, make a deal vignette. They had doing these little mini movies to promote big pay-per-view matches. So at that point, I kind of knew, like a lot of, traditional wrestling fans that did like the Barry Windhams and the Magnum TAs and the Tully Blanchards, like, okay, this has gone in a different direction, and either you're going to keep on watching and just accept some of this theatrical stuff, or you're going to not watch. And I
And find
continued to
something else to
watch.
do.
Yeah. And I want to get to some of Laz's comments because our buddy here from Australia. Um,
Thank you
to
for
answer,
listening in, Laza.
yeah, Laz is great, and he actually, Laz was my first cameo. I was inspired by Laz's cameo experiences to do cameo, and Laza got a cameo from me. Not sure if it was USWA era Undertaker is the Master of Pain. He
It
feuded with
was.
Jerry. It was Laza. In fact, he actually won that Memphis title. Jerry Lawler has like what 107, Memphis
Yeah, I think Jerry
championships.
Lawler has the most championships out of anyone in wrestling history. But that's easy to happen when you're the one booking the territory.
Yeah, and
But he was great in his day, and my dad always hammers home. He says, unless you lived through that time, James, my dad's told me this many times. Unless you lived through that time, you can't comprehend just how big of a deal Jerry the King Lawler was.
yes, my last landlord here in Florida actually is a guy that was a wrestling fan in Memphis, and he saw a lot of USWA shows or Memphis CWA shows in the Mid South Coliseum, and he would tell me Jerry Lawler stories, of going there on Monday nights, just like Madison Square Garden in the 70s and early 80s was Monday nights. That was the
Yeah.
same thing, Monday nights in Memphis. Let me get to some other thoughts. This one I've been holding for a while. We talked about Andre the Giant earlier, and how, in my opinion, it's kind of like Andre the Giant passed the torch to the Undertaker. There's actually a very, very interesting little clip. It's on YouTube. It can be found. I want to say, Jimmy, it's like January of '92, and it's in, what's that thing called? The Prince Albert Hall in the UK. I think that's what it's
I know
called.
what you're referencing.
Yeah, and I believe it's a 25-man battle royal. I won't give it away. I won't say who wins, but it's a 25-man battle royal, and the Undertaker is one of the 25 men, if I'm remembering this correctly. And the way that the video on YouTube, the way that I found it, was Andre the Giant and, the Undertaker in the same match. Kind of, kind of. The Undertaker is an official participant in the battle royal. Andre the Giant, because he's got the bad leg at this point, or the bad hip, he comes out, or probably the bad back is what it was. Andre the Giant comes out about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the battle royal from the dressing room to ringside, does a little bit of a cameo. Speaking of cameo, Andre does a little cameo with his crutch to whack somebody. I think Mr. Perfect. Um, so technically, Andre and Mean Mark Callis, The Undertaker, are not in the same match, but because Andre wasn't officially in the match, but Andre makes an appearance in this Undertaker match. I think that, Jimmy, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's some promo somewhere on YouTube where like they happen to have the Undertaker.
They had an interaction.
They had an interaction, exactly, and I'm trying to remember exactly what that was, but it's in some ways, buddy, it's good for me just to know. And on top of that, just Steve Austin for a second. At that Clash of the Champions 1992, August of 92, when they did like the 20 years of wrestling on TBS, Steve Austin got to meet Andre the Giant. He just went over and introduced himself and shook his hand. It's nice to know, as a wrestling historian, from both of our perspectives, that the Undertaker got to interact with Andre and that Stone Cold got to shake his hand. I think that's kind of cool.
I think it is great. And here's something else. Undertaker talked on the Austin podcast regarding Andre. And he said, for whatever reason, Andre just loved me. He just did. He liked being around me. And he said, whenever I would see him, he would say, "You and me, boss, I have an idea." And he would always tease Mark that he had this idea of working with him. And the only one who knew what Andre's idea was Timmy White, because he was Andre's handler. I can only speculate what Andre had in mind, but knowing Andre and how he approached the business, I would guess he wanted to have a program where he put over The Undertaker. Now, The Undertaker's undefeated streak at WrestleMania is impressive as it was. Let's step into another reality for a minute.
Sure. Yeah.
Imagine if instead of Jimmy Superfly Snuka, the first victim is Andre the Giant. What does that do for The Undertaker? That early in his run, that his first WrestleMania victory is Andre the Giant. Because I believe that's what Andre wanted. He wanted to go out to a person that he knew would maintain the respect of the business and the loyalty to the business, because it was clear that Taker was that dude that Andre was for years. But could you imagine what that would have been like? The match probably wouldn't have been a technical masterpiece. It wouldn't have been a Briscoe Funk classic. But I think the image of The Undertaker crossing Andre's arms as Paul Bear holds the sacred urn and defeating Andre the Giant would have been a moment in time. It would have been a moment that would have made Undertaker an instant main eventer, which his debut already got that job done. This would have been just the proverbial nail in the coffin.
Right.
But yeah, I speculate that Andre wanted to work with him, and that's why he kept telling him that. Unfortunately, it never happened because Andre's health just wouldn't allow it. That's one match of Undertaker's I wish we could have gotten. I don't know if you could think of a match with him that didn't happen that you would have liked to have seen. We mentioned Terry Funk a few weeks ago. Could you imagine an actual feud with The Undertaker and Terry Funk, two Texans that don't give a damn, going balls to the wall, especially when Terry could still go? You know, that would have been interesting. The obvious match that people wish would have happened is the match with Sting.
Right.
We could talk about that all night. A match that no one thinks about, but I'm sure you'll nod your head when you hear it. When Taker could still go, a match with him and Samoa Joe.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Because Joe, to me, and maybe I'm biased, and I have no shame in admitting that, Samoa Joe is one of my top 10 favorites.
Okay.
I'm not saying he's top 10 greatest, because favorites and greatest are different.
Sure.
He's one of my favorites. I believe Samoa Joe, especially prime Samoa Joe, when he was undefeated in TNA, is one of those guys that you could have used to get sympathy on The Undertaker. Because could you imagine him bloodying the Undertaker, putting him in that choke, and the Undertaker just wilting away as Joe chokes him out. I think that would have been a good feud because Taker showed he wrestled well with other big guys. Even though he wrestled great with smaller guys like Brett, like Shawn, like Kurt Angle, and Rey Mysterio. He had great matches with all of them. But he also had good matches with Kane.
Right.
He had good matches with Diesel. And he had good matches with Batista. He had good matches with Triple H, with all of these guys that are big in stature.
Yes.
And Joe, he's one of those, he's a weird case in that he's big and thick, but the guy can wrestle like he's got a third gear. And I think that would have been an interesting match. And again, I feel Samoa Joe is one of the few that would have been able to get the audience to sympathize with it. Because Joe, when he wants to, knows how to make the audience feel uncomfortable when he's delivering punishment. Like Brock Lesnar, for example.
Right.
Switching gears, if we can, and I'd like to throw it to you. Who do you feel brought out the best in The Undertaker, bell to bell?
Well, I think it's a thing of timing. And actually, let me just jump on the Samoa Joe thing for a second. I think
Please do.
the best era for that match would have been about 2007, when Samoa Joe was just in the middle of that Kurt Angle feud that kind of went a year and a half, and Samoa Joe didn't have to be necessarily undefeated, but he was
No.
pretty much unbeatable. But this kind of ties into my next point. You asked me who got the best out of the Undertaker, who did he have the best matches with? For me, it's the time. I feel that the Undertaker's first year in the WWF was great. He was a heel. He was just kind of beating guys. Then he got the title for a week. They did that Tuesday in Texas thing. I'll throw this in here now. I kind of feel like I was thinking about this today when the Undertaker beat Hulk Hogan at Survivor Series 1990 for a bunch of reasons. To me, I think you could kind of say that was the metaphorical end of the golden era, like the first, Hulk Hogan, 1984, 1985. Because if you think about it, Jimmy, after Taker beat Hogan at that Survivor Series for the title, Hogan did have the title. He got the title 3 more times. But first he beat Undertaker in the rematch at Tuesday in Texas. And then they held it up. And then, the Royal Rumble, Flair gets it, et cetera, et cetera. And then Hogan gets it at that goofy WrestleMania 9 thing, loses it at King of the Ring. Then he leaves the company, the NWO, Hollywood Hogan, blah, blah, blah. And when Hogan comes back in 2002, he gets the belt for a month. And I believe that's the last Hogan ever had of the title. So if you just go
And
back,
he lost to The Undertaker, ironically.
and he lost to the Undertaker again. So if you go back, which is great stuff. But if you go back and you say, once the Undertaker beat Hogan at Survivor Series 1990, and Hogan had the I'm sorry, 91.
91,
Hogan,
yes.
yes, Hogan had the title since WrestleMania 7 in 91,
When he beat
beating
Sergeant Slaughter.
So he goes from WrestleMania, which is the beginning of April, I think, that year, or maybe the end of March, but he goes from April, let's say, until November. And that's a pretty good, 6-month title run, right?
That's a pretty decent run, yes.
Yeah. And then once the Undertaker beats him, you can pretty much say that that's the end of the great Hulk Hogan title runs. He's going to have one more victory over the Taker, and then he's going to have that, title run.
That quasi kind of run between
Right.
WrestleMania and King of the Ring when he lost it to Yokozuna.
Right. And he never really defended it. And then he's going to
No,
have
he didn't.
that. He's going to have that 1 month thing where he beats Triple H with a bunch of outside
Which was
interference.
a last minute thing because
Right.
the NWO thing was supposed to continue to the best of my knowledge, but no one counted on Hogan getting the support that he did when he had that match with The Rock. That was
Right.
something that nobody saw coming. And I'm sure Kevin Nash and Scott Hall weren't happy because then their legs got cut out because Hogan was out of the NWO. And, it's no disrespect to them, but if you don't have the NWO with Hulk Hogan, NWO doesn't work. It's like the Horsemen without Flair. It doesn't work.
Right.
Evolution without Triple H, it doesn't work.
So let me get to answering your question here because I side trailed us, but going back to your question, when do I think the Undertaker is best wrestling? If you look to the next stage of Undertaker, when he turns babyface, he's helping Randy Savage and Elizabeth, against Jake the Snake Roberts. He gets that kind of goofy tombstone victory, count out victory over Taker. I'm sorry, over Jake the Snake at WrestleMania 8 at the Hoosier Dome. Then he's wrestling like the Carnival of Freaks. I mean, he's wrestling the equivalent to WCW's Dungeon of Doom. He's wrestling
Oh, good Lord.
Giant Gonzalez and King Kong
Kamala,
Bundys and Kamalas at SummerSlams. And
Mama Mustafa.
then you get into, the first. I watched the SummerSlam '94 match, Undertaker versus Undertaker match. Interesting, probably a better promotion than an actual payoff. Apparently, the story with that is that the pay-per-view was running short on time. So basically, it became almost a squash match in the real Undertaker's favor. Uh, but Undertaker said this himself, Jimmy. It wasn't until like 96, 97, and I think the 96 match against Diesel at WrestleMania 12, which kind of stole the show. I think that match was better than Shawn versus Brett. I think that's when we start seeing Undertaker can go, and he can go at the highest level. And the reality is, Jimmy, he could have gone, meaning have really great actual wrestling matches. Undertaker could have done that the whole time. But this, gimmick
He
or
held himself
character,
back because of the character, because
yeah,
he wanted that when he delivered those big moves, it wowed the audience. If he does it all match long, there's no wow. Basically, what he was doing was he was going to make those big spots mean something. In other words, giving purpose to the moves, not just doing them for the sake of doing them to fill time, which is what we call psychology, which
right.
is a lost art in wrestling. I would think both of us would say.
Oh yeah,
And I believe Brett talked about this when Taker found out he was going to be working with him at Royal Rumble 96. And he said that he was excited about working with Brett because I could finally show people that I can wrestle. And I recall that match being pretty damn good. The match that he had with Brett at Royal Rumble 96 where he tombstoned him and then Diesel pulled the referee out and flipped Taker off. I believe that
right.
was the first time that obscene gesture was ever used on WWF television. He had the match with Diesel at WrestleMania, which wasn't a bad match. It
I think it
wasn't
was a good,
great,
really.
but it
I
wasn't
thought
bad.
I thought it was a great match. Yeah,
And then that very next night, he's having a match with Justin Hawk Bradshaw. He lays him out with the tombstone. And then this psychotic lunatic in a mask comes out, beats the shit out of The Undertaker, drops an elbow off the apron and the mandible claw. And we're off to the races. Because in my humble opinion, the person who brought out the best in The Undertaker was Mankind. Don't get me wrong. The matches with Shawn Michaels were great. The Hell in a Cell was great. WrestleMania 25 was great. But if you're talking about consistently working with someone, match after match after match, Mankind for me is that dude. King of the Ring 96, a classic. The Boiler Room Brawl, a classic. The first match I ever saw live on pay-per-view, the Buried Alive match. That was my first pay-per-view. The card wasn't anything to go crazy about. Sid versus Vader, Powerbomb versus Powerbomb. Austin, Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Who knew those two were going to become the legends that they did? You had a tag team match. I think it was the Smoking Guns versus Owen and Davey Boy. And then the main event was Mankind and The Undertaker in the Buried Alive match. And that was my first pay-per-view. And I watched that match, which I thought was a pretty damn good match, gimmicks aside. And then they get to the spot where the Undertaker choke slams Mankind into the grave.
right.
And they're filling it with and he's filling it with earth. The bell rings, the Undertaker's declared the winner, but then Terry Gordy, under the mask as the executioner, whacks him over the head with the shovel. They pull Mankind out, they toss the Undertaker in, and him and Terry Gordy start trying to bury him, but they realize It's going to take them at least an hour and a half to do it. So Vince sends all the heels out, Crush, Bradshaw, Triple H, Goldust, to finish burying The Undertaker. And how does that pay-per-view end? A lightning bolt hits the tombstone, and the hand comes up. And Mikey, I know it's hokey. I know it's gaga. I know it's not the pro wrestling of Harley and Dusty and Terry Funk that we love, but I have to be brutally honest with you. When I saw his hand come up from that grave, 6-year-old me was glued to the TV going forward. I never missed Nitro. I never missed Raw. I made sure I got to see both. That moment of his hand coming up from that grave with Vince McMahon, he's alive. The Undertaker is still alive. I will never forget that as long as I live, because it was a moment that I was a fan for life.
Yeah.
That's it. That was it for me. They ended up having a match in MSG, where Paul Bear was hanging from the shark cage. We talked about that earlier. Then they had a no-holds-barred match on Raw. Then the one title match they had, which was In Your House, Revenge of the Taker. The one time they wrestled for the belt. Again, I thought it was a pretty damn good match. And what was the result of that match? Paul Bear's face was burned by The Undertaker. And what did that lead to? That led to the storyline of Kane, which, if you're talking about storytelling, whether we go from Paul Bear trying to pull The Undertaker back to his side, Paul Bear blackmailing The Undertaker because of the fire, Taker didn't want that story out, then Undertaker breaking free and learning his brother is still alive, and then I believe it was yesterday, 26 years ago, the Hell in a Cell match with Shawn Michaels. Easily the greatest cell match I've ever seen.
Yes.
Taker hits Shawn over the head with the chair. Taker does the throat slash, and the lights go down, and here comes Kane. And for WWF, best debut in the history of that company. And Kane rips that door off. And Taker, being the professional that he is conveying his emotions with his face. Imagine it just for a moment. You lost your parents. You believe you've lost your brother. And 20 years later, that sibling is standing before you with hatred in their eyes. Anyone that has a sibling, anyone that's had issues with sibling can feel that. And Taker who never has ever allowed anyone to mess with him, Kane tombstones him, smacks him, and Taker doesn't touch him. You could feel that, Taker's last promise to his parents, he would never hurt his brother. And that whole story where Kane burned him in the casket and The Undertaker was gone. And then that iconic moment on Raw where the lightning bolt hits the coffin, it splits open. And there he is with the puff of smoke, promising Kane that now you're going to pay.
Right.
Because as Popeye the Sailor once said, I can't stands when I can't stands no more. I'm going to whip your ass, brother. And they had, at WrestleMania 14, which I understand was drawn by Austin and Tyson. I recognize that. But the video package, the entrances, the stare down, the match, the aftermath, that whole deal of Undertaker and Kane, it didn't feel like a one-man show like pro wrestling so often feels like these days. Even though you knew Austin and winning the title from Michaels with Tyson as the referee was the deal, the Taker and Kane story didn't feel secondary. It felt just as important, even though nothing was on the line. It was a grudge match.
Right.
Which, those grudge matches where they have a really juicy story with two guys who can't stand each other so badly, and now it's coming to a head. It was a big deal. Kane kicking out of the tombstone, no one had ever done that.
Hey, you forgot about Pete Rose Wasn't that
Oh,
the first?
Jesus.
That was the first of the
And
Pete.
for a brief moment, Kane was the biggest baby face in the Boston in Boston that night.
Yeah, which was just to jump in for the fans that might have forgotten. They're in
Yeah,
the
that,
Boston Garden. The Boston Garden, big stronghold for WWE, big stronghold for the Red
yes,
Sox and everybody else. And Pete Rose, who I've actually met in person, he was nice to me. Pete Rose comes out, he insults Boston, he talks about Bill Buckner. This is well, actually, yeah, this was before they had
that was
won the World
classic heel
Series.
stuff.
Yeah, this is about 6 years before the Red Sox had ended the curse of the Bambino and
Yeah,
won a
they ended
World
the curse of
Series.
the
So
Bambino.
right,
I still
so
can't believe that happened. I was
yeah,
upstate when they were playing the Yankees before they made it to the World Series. The Yankees were hitting one home run after another, and then Boston, the Yankees just collapsed. As you know, it happens. But yeah, that was a nice little bonus to give the Boston crowd a little something.
yeah, and
Um,
then and my point is that to me, Jimmy, if you were a real wrestling fan, in a lot of ways, the Kane Undertaker, we knew that that was going to be a good match, and when say that, I mean it was common knowledge, you know, even if you were just a TV wrestling fan, if you didn't get on the internet or the Observer at the time, everyone knew that Shawn Michaels had a bad back. He hadn't
mhm,
wrestled since the Royal Rumble against the Undertaker, and when
yeah,
he hurt his back on the casket. So
yes,
my point is, if you were there, if you paid the $25 or the $35 to watch WrestleMania 14 from Boston, either on pay per view or in person, the match from a wrestling fan's perspective was Kane versus the Undertaker. That was the story match. The Austin thing, in my opinion, was a foregone conclusion. We knew that Austin was going to get the belt. We knew that Shawn was going in there hurt. We knew that that was going to happen. But Kane and Undertaker, we weren't really sure what was going to happen.
no, because that there was a mystery to Kane because Kane was the first person that you thought the Undertaker was kind of intimidated by, or that you weren't certain Taker could beat him because Kane was running through all of Undertaker's previous opponents. He
Including
ran through
Vader.
Mankind, he ran through Vader, he ran through Crush, he ran through Ahmed Johnson. I mean, anyone that got in Kane's path, short of Steve Austin, because they didn't actually touch, Kane was dropping him with a choke slam and a tombstone. And Paul Bear, again, I cannot praise that man enough.
Yeah.
Just like Bobby Heenan was the storyteller for Hogan and Andre, Paul Bear was the storyteller of Undertaker and Kane. And I have to give credit to Paul Bear because without him, this would not have worked as well. And I say that as someone who respects both performers. But at that time, for that show, Paul Bear was the straw that stirred the drink, and he was the reason that storyline had juice to it. Because who was the one manipulating Kane to
Right.
hate his brother? It was Paul Bear. Who was the one that stabbed the Undertaker in the back? It was Paul Bear. And for Kane, who was like a Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees like character, it wouldn't have worked if he was the one verbalizing his hatred.
Right.
Paul Bear, much like at the beginning of Undertaker's career, it was important that he be there to verbalize for his charge to let you know, Undertaker, your brother's going to make your life a living hell until you agree to face him. And I remember watching those segments every week where Paul was just again, doesn't get credit for being the incredible promo that he was. He
Right.
said it with Jim Cornette in the Ring of Honor shoot that they did together. He said he and Taker's stuff was never scripted. They always did their stuff on the fly. And they talked with each other about what they were going to do. So they were the storytellers. And it was great. I know Mick Foley feels that his character wasn't as strong when he rekindled his feud with The Undertaker. And to a degree, I don't disagree because of the shifts from Mankind to Dude Love to Cactus
Right.
Jack in a pretty short order. But when I saw that they were going to fight again, And this time it was going to be in the same cage that the Undertaker mangled Shawn Michaels in. I was like, ooh, this I
Yeah.
must see. I watched that match with my father.
King of the Ring, 98 you're talking about.
Yep, in the igloo. And when the Undertaker threw him off that cage, my father never cursed in front of me when I was a kid. But because my mother would have killed him.
Right.
But when Taker threw Mick off that cage, I'll never forget my father jumping off the couch. Holy shit! I thought he was dead. And I was
Yeah.
actually scared because I didn't want to see someone die on TV.
Sure.
And what I'll remember most about that night, other than the fact that Mick took a horrific beating that he never should have taken, but the image I'll always remember is that cell high up, Taker standing on top of it, looking dominant. And by his own words, in recent years, he was petrified from Mick.
Sure.
So, because they were obviously dear friends. But as a true professional, while they were getting Mick out of that area where he was thrown off, Taker was maintaining his aura. And as Mick is being carted away the first time, there was a rumbling in the audience. And what did you hear? Undertaker. Undertaker. That audience was hanging on everything they did. How Mick climbed back up, I'll never know. With a broken, with a separated shoulder, I'll never know. And we remember how he went through, which was the choke slam.
Yep.
Now, for any of us that watched their matches, Mick always got up nice and high for the choke slam. Not that night, because he didn't have the strength. But as Mick has said, it is a good thing he didn't. Because had he had the strength, he would have over-rotated and he could have broke his neck and he would have died on impact when that cage gave way.
Yeah.
Because he just fell back, he landed on his mid-back rather than his neck. It was the most horrific bump I've ever seen anyone take. And I remember my father, because my father watched Mick from when he was Cactus Jack. My
Right.
dad used to tape trade because he loved Cactus Jack. And I remember him looking nervous because, and I came to find out years later, I was 8 years old. I didn't know any better then. He was worried for Mick, like, this guy might never wrestle again. He might be seriously injured. And he was.
Yes.
But to Mick's credit, he endured. They finished that match. I don't know how the hell they did. I believe they set the bar insanely high where no one is ever going to be able to match up to that. Nobody should try to, please.
No, they shouldn't. Yeah.
Taker then would go on to do the ministry deal, which I enjoyed up
No,
until...
Hold on 1 second, Jimmy.
What?
The thing is with that June 1998, Mick Foley goes from the top of the cell into the ring. He goes off the top of the cell to the floor. He not only came back and wrestled again and won the WWF World Title later that year, Jimmy. Mick Foley as Mankind came back that same night to help
and ran interference in the title match
to help Kane beat Steve Austin in the first blood match.
And I'm sure the whole audience is like, how is he not at the hospital?
Yeah.
This poor guy. I mean, and no offense, and I'm not trying to take shots at Vince, but how the hell did you let him walk through that curtain? You couldn't do that, run in?
Yeah, and just to get back to something you said before, Terry Funk and the Undertaker, did they ever work a program? Did they ever have a match? I don't remember them having a match, but I do know that they had physical contact at the Hell in the Cell because Terry Funk Terry Funk broke kind of character because in theory he and Mankind, Mick Foley, were on the outs with each other, but Funk goes into the ring to check on Mick Foley, his on again off again partner, and he takes a nice choke slam from the Undertaker just to give Foley a spot. I want to answer your question from earlier before we get into some more stuff. You asked me my favorite, who I thought was the best opponent. And what I was getting at was that I think it's different different eras. You know, it's funny because the Undertaker lasted through all these eras, and during the Attitude Era, Jimmy, I kind of feel like, and I'm talking 97, 98, 99. I feel like The Rock and Austin were so hot in many of those years, and to a lesser extent, Shawn Michaels while he was still active. I feel like the Undertaker kind of became the support guy for these other guys, namely for Austin and The Rock to a lesser extent.
Okay.
I feel that when those guys went away, Austin because of injuries and The Rock because of Hollywood, I think for me, I might be one of the few people that actually did like the American Badass era. And I feel like that post he did the American Badass, he puts over Brock Lesnar a lot, kind of put Lesnar on the map, maybe more than he should have, more than he had to.
He absolutely
He
did. He
he
did more
comes
for
back.
Lesnar's career than anybody else.
Right. And they had a Hell in a Cell at 2002.
Yes.
If people have seen their, what was it, 2016 Hell in a Cell, go back to the
15. It
2002,
was
2015.
2015, their last one. But
Right. So go back.
2002, holy
Yeah.
shit.
I have a DVD right over there, Jimmy, that I'm going to watch later. I watched that 2002 at a movie theater in Providence, Rhode Island. There was this movie theater called The Castle that would have the monthly pay-per-views of WWF on the big screen.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I saw Undertaker and Brock in the Hell in a Cell on a movie theater screen in live as it happened. My favorite
Love
era
that.
yes, my favorite era of the Undertaker. We get to WrestleMania 20. He does the Kane thing. He brings back the Dead Man. I feel that there was a time 2000. I want to say 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009. He's doing the Dead Man, but he's already done the American Badass. That's come and gone. And the Undertaker at this point, he's kind of the guy. For like 4 or 5 years, it's him and Edge. It's him and Dave Batista. It's the double shot with Shawn. It's
The feud with Randy Orton.
the feud with Randy Orton that has a Hell in the Cell. I forgot about this, but apparently he actually put over Kane 3 times in pay-per-view matches. Like they had a third iteration of their
2010,
feud.
he did.
Yeah,
And the first one was 100% clean. The
right.
first match they had, which was no holds barred, it was as clean as a sheet. Clean as a sheet. And let me tell you, to do 3 straight jobs on pay-per-view shows you the kind of level of respect he had for Glenn Jacobs,
Yes.
because Kane was the one eating a lot of those losses back in the day, like the WrestleMania 14 match that we discussed. Kane lost that one. Both Inferno matches they had, Kane lost that one. The WrestleMania 20 match that you referenced, Kane lost that one. So this was Taker, in my view, giving back to Kane because he was the heavyweight champion. And what better way to solidify yourself as heavyweight champion by saying, I had 3 title defenses against The Undertaker. I beat him all 3 times. That did, not that Kane needed it at that time,
Right.
but Taker still thought enough of him to put him over, because Taker was smart enough to understand that Kane's character and his mere existence added a whole other layer to the Undertaker character as well. So it was a perfect marriage in a lot of ways, him and Kane. And like you said, accurately, 2005, 2006, 7, 8, 9, Taker was cranking out matches left and right that were just great. The
Yeah.
WrestleMania match he had with Randy Orton, which was pretty damn good.
Yes.
The Hell in a Cell match that they had, which, because it was a story that went from WrestleMania all the way through December. Good matches. How about the match he had with Kurt Angle at No Way Out? I mean, when Dusty Rhodes, God rest his soul, turns around and says that he had watched that match between The Undertaker and Kurt Angle, and he said, watching it, it made you proud to be in this business. That's as high a compliment as you could possibly get coming from the Dream.
Yes.
Then later that same year, he's having a feud with Mr. Kennedy, Ken Anderson. And they had a series of matches that weren't half bad.
Right.
Then he goes into 2007. He wins the Royal Rumble and he has that feud with Batista, which morphed into the feud with Edge. And we got 2 WrestleManias in a row where Taker's kneeling down, holding up the heavyweight championship. I'm not going to lie. When he fought Batista, I thought that was going to be the end. Because
Okay.
I said in my head, Batista's up and coming. He's the champion. The biggest way they could put him over is by having him break the streak.
Right.
And when I saw him power slam The Undertaker, bulldog style, through the table, and then hit the Batista bomb, I turned my head away from the camera because I didn't want to see it. And then Taker does the unthinkable, kicks out of the Batista bomb, which had never happened up until that point. This was back when finishing moves actually mattered.
Right.
Taker hits 1 tombstone, gets the 3 count. I'm sitting there on my couch with my left leg in a cast because I had gotten hit by a car a few months prior. So I was
Ouch.
laid up. And I see him win the World Heavyweight title. To me, I always looked at the big gold belt. That's Ric Flair's belt. That's
Sure.
Sting's belt. That's Dusty Rhodes' belt. And to see Taker hold it was different. And to me, it was like, now he's on that level. Because I always looked at Ric Flair as like the greatest. I always
Yes.
looked at Dusty Rhodes as on par with Flair. And you know what I think of Sting.
Yeah.
So to see Taker have that belt, I was so happy. Like, happy. I saved up my money when I was 17 years old. I saved up my money to get my own replica of the World Heavyweight title. And I made certain, I probably chewed this poor person's ears off when I ordered it. This was back when you had to call in your orders. You couldn't just order it online. You had to call in to WWE Shop.
Right.
Would you like a nameplate? Yes, I would. What name do you want? Undertaker. You sure? Yes. You don't want Batista? You don't want Judge? No. I want the Undertaker. And when I got that belt, I made sure I hung that belt on my wall that I proudly displayed ever since I moved away and got married. That belt is in a Rubbermaid somewhere in my folks' attic. Once my wife and I get out of our apartment, that will be hung up again. I just remember being extremely happy that he had that belt.
Yes.
And he has the feud with Edge, which I thought did wonders for Edge. Then 2008, he finished the feud with Edge. Kind of the last part of the year, feuded with the Big Show. They had some good matches. They were all gimmick matches, last man standing, casket matches.
Pujami prison at some point.
Yeah, that was in 2006. I skipped that, the feud with Kali.
Yeah.
They had one good match in that whole feud, and that was the last man standing.
Right.
And then we get to Shawn Michaels. That was where I got nervous as a Taker fan because I said, this is the one guy he's never been able to beat.
Right.
So, and my future brother-in-law has said every wrestler's got their kryptonite. Taker had several. He had Brock and he had Shawn. 2 guys he was never able to beat in a singles match. And when Shawn Michaels was coming at the streak, I said, ooh, this might be a legend versus legends deal where Shawn he's got too much because he's skilled. He could go the distance. And then they proceeded to have the best match I ever saw in my life, which was WrestleMania 25 on a card that sucked to me.
And
The card was not that good.
Let me jump in real quick.
Please do. I'm so sorry.
No, one of the reasons why that card sucked, Jimmy, is because according to Triple H, the mandate came down that day of WrestleMania 25, which they were making a huge deal that this is the 25th anniversary of WrestleMania, and Triple H is in the main event against Randy Orton for the title, and it's this big grudge thing. And the word came down, hey folks, we're going PG as of today, as of WrestleMania 25. And nobody on that, and then you also had things like Snooki on that show and a lot of stuff that wasn't that great. And the one match that saved that show was the Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. And the fact that they went PG and they weren't supposed to be as violent as they had been, or they weren't supposed to be as adult themed, and probably not going to be able to juice, as in bleed. But those guys, Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, made the adjustments. And whether they had to make adjustments or not, they had the best match of the year, one of the best matches we've ever seen. And uh, Shawn Michaels, who, I'm not a big fan of his on some levels, but professionally, he has hell of a great matches against everybody. But that's
Yes,
one of Shawn Michaels's best matches too. A-
absolutely.
And what I liked about their feud, and I'll give you my answer to the question, who brought out the best in the Undertaker? I'll say that to me, it's one is Shawn Michaels, and two is Triple H. For me personally, I'd put three as Mick Foley, and I did like the Ric Flair WrestleMania 18 match too, but that was kind of a one-off. To me,
Yeah, that was actually a really good. That was a really, really fun match. I
yeah,
love the Arn Anderson spot. And I remember my dad going nuts with that because he was a big Horseman fan.
yeah.
So when he saw Arn, he's like, is Tully Blanchard there? Is Barry Windham there? He thought the Horsemen were going to start football kicking Taker. I'm like, Dad, they're all at the retirement home. This isn't 1989. This is 2002.
Well, to
But
me, that was a better. I mean, just as my own interest, Jimmy, like
yeah,
the Flair Undertaker build up for Mania 18, the
it
of
was
of
good.
Undertaker, yeah, Undertaker going down to developmental to pick up Ric Flair's son and beat the crap out of him in the
What are
development in
you
an
doing?
OVW or
I'm
whatever it was.
kicking your ass. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, that was a better match than Rock Hogan. Now, granted, everyone talks about Rock Hogan, but I think
Oh, it
Flair
was.
Taker,
It
yeah,
was.
yeah, um,
That
my
superplex spot off the top, I was like, "Oh my god, that poor guy had a plane crash. Why would you do that?"
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
That
I
was
gotta watch that match
brutal.
again.
That was brutal. That way, Taker went all the way to the top, and Taker's 6'11", so
Yeah.
Flair was high up. Like, holy damn!
There's a nice compliment. Let's get to some of Laz's comments because I've been we've passed over a few. I want to get back to a couple of things. This is a nice thing to say, Jimmy. You want to read this comment from Laza of the stream?
Can't help myself. Have to say it. Jimmy has a Joel Gerther thing going on. Love the charisma. Have you ever thought of becoming a pro wrestling manager? You
Joel
would
Gertner from the ECW, the Dudleys, is what he's talking about.
well, well, well. Thank you for that, Laza. I appreciate the compliment. I wanted to be a wrestling commentator, believe it or not, because I love calling action. I love talking, obviously. Um, The only thing that stopped me from getting into the business is the fact that I'm very close with my family. And the idea of not seeing my family 300 days a year, the trade-off just wasn't worth it for me. And that's the only reason I didn't try. But if I ever did try to get into the business, it would have either been as a manager or as a commentator because I love talking about the action. So I thank you for your compliment. Thank you very much.
Laza's all the way in Australia, and Laza had this to say earlier, which I want to get back to. Kane also had a good tag team with Al Snow in SMW, Smoky Mountain Wrestling. That's when Kane, I think, was called Unabomber,
Unibomb.
which was Unabomb. Thank you, which was very timely at the time. Probably something that wouldn't have made the big stage just because of it's one of those controversial wrestling gimmicks because
Yes.
it was a homage to the Unabomber, but and then Laza did ask, did Al Snow ever align with Kane and Paul Bearer against the Undertaker?
No, he did not.
He did not. I think Al Snow was kind of in mid card mania mode in WWF at the time, and he was a kind of a gimmick mid card. they took the ECW version of Al Snow and they made it mid card level WWF comedy stuff, but that's okay. Um, so to me, Jimmy, to answer your question, I think Shawn Michaels was and also one thing I will say about this, and I'll let you go back to the WrestleMania 25 when they did WrestleMania 25, WrestleMania 26 against Shawn. From my memory, Jimmy, in the hype for that, they never referenced their previous 1997-98 feud when you had, Shawn against The Undertaker in the very first and probably still the very best Hell in the Cell.
Yeah.
The casket match at Royal Rumble 98, which effectively ended Shawn's career for
They
4 years.
briefly did reference it where Shawn told Taker, despite all of your WrestleMania opponents, you have never beaten me and you never will. And then Taker said, "You're right. I never have defeated you. But the last time we wrestled, you had to take a break for 5 years." So
Did they
they
say,
kind of sort of referenced it in
okay,
the build-up.
yeah,
You have to also remember, this was a time where I was religiously watching Raw and SmackDown. In 2009, I was hooked. Between that and TNA, I was watching as much wrestling as I could. I caught a little bit of Ring of Honor, so I got to see a little bit of Bryan Danielson and Nigel McGuinness. But Taker was still there more often than not, so I wasn't missing him for anything. Ironically, heading into WrestleMania 25, I was actually a Randy Orton fan. I loved his gimmick where he was kicking all the McMahons in the head. I wanted to see him beat Triple H. I thought, honestly, the reason I thought WrestleMania 25 sucked had very little to do with violence. WrestleMania 25 to me was a dud due to booking. And my
yeah.
reasoning for that was this. Just going to go on a brief tangent. I'll keep
Go
it
ahead.
as brief as I can. Money in the Bank, I felt should have went to Christian. I felt Edge should have retained the World Heavyweight title and have Christian catch in on him right there. Because that would a feud between Edge and Christian for the World Heavyweight title would have been interesting. But had to give him another one, I guess. The Matt Hardy and Edge match, that Matt Hardy and Jeff Hardy match was fine. I saw nothing wrong with it. Randy Orton and Triple H should have been no holds barred. Why it wasn't, considering how heated the feud was. You know as well as I do, the gimmicks come when the feud is at its peak. That was the peak of their feud. So that's where a no holds barred stipulation would have been absolutely justified. The Taker Shawn match, I would leave exactly the way it was. I wouldn't change a damn thing about that. The Snooki thing we probably could do without.
Yeah.
I would say you don't need that celebrity.
No.
Let me see. I don't really remember a lot.
Was that the one with Jerry Lawler and Michael Cole? Was that the Jerry Lawler Michael Cole one?
That was 27.
Okay.
Another dud of a WrestleMania that was saved by The Undertaker.
Yep. Against Triple H.
Yes, when he got carted out. That was actually the night that he came out to my favorite Johnny Cash song.
Oh,
Ain't No Grave. Ironically, now this is something that I'm happy to share. I'm a big video game guy. So whenever the wrestling games came out, I would always create my own characters. I would create myself, obviously, the way I wanted to be.
Sure.
And in those days, the PlayStation 3 allowed you to put your own music as your entrance. Now, The Undertaker had disappeared because Kane had buried him alive with the Nexus. A few weeks before 2/21/11, when Taker made his return, I created my friends, my characters, and I gave them each their music. My friend had The Trooper. Another friend of mine had Wherever I May Roam by Metallica. And I had Ain't No Grave by Johnny Cash as my entrance. My friends used to come by and watch Raw with me. We had just played the video game before Raw started. And then the 2/21/11 thing was counting down. And then The Undertaker revealed himself. And then the Johnny Cash music hit. My friends all looked at me saying, "Did you know they were going to use it?" Like, I had no idea. And God is my judge, I had no clue they were going to use that as his entrance.
Yeah. That's
so
cool.
my friends are like, you're truly linked to this fucking guy. Pardon my French.
That's all right.
And it was just, I'll never forget that. I popped for a
Yeah.
second there. I forgot it was a show, and I just lost my mind, because what are the odds? What I use as my entrance in a game, he's going to use as his entrance when he returns. And
Yeah.
honestly, when he turned into the part-time defending the streak every year type thing,
Right.
I felt he should have kept that song, because Ain't No Grave actually fits the Undertaker character, because Father Time hadn't caught up with him yet.
Yeah.
But
That's good.
yeah, that's just a little side story about another thing that I love about Taker. He has good taste in music, because I love Johnny Cash.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I was just there's so many things we could say here. I mean, even that squash match he had over Cena, which was I thought that was actually handled pretty well. And I can't remember the numbers of the WrestleManias after a certain point, but when Cena was kind of goading Undertaker to wrestle him at WrestleMania, I think that was 2017 or 2018, Jimmy.
It was
And
18, and that was actually during a year that I took off from wrestling entirely.
okay, so they were still doing Brock and Roman back then. That was their second of 3 WrestleMania main events, and John Cena had been pestering, like trolling the Undertaker for about a month, trying to get this dream match of Cena versus the Taker, and they never officially announced the match. But when you get to WrestleMania, John Cena's got a ticket in the audience, and there's been no sign of the Undertaker. And then John Cena gets in the ring and does a little bit of a bit with Elias. I believe
Yeah.
that's what happened. And then shish boom bam, the Undertaker comes out and he basically beats Cena in a 2.5 minute squash. And to me, Jimmy, what I liked about that was that it was obvious or apparent in retrospect. Okay, the Undertaker's got a bad hip. He's not going to be able to wrestle a full match, so they didn't advertise it. And I think of all the criticisms I give to WWE, I'll give them credit here to not advertise that you've got John Cena versus The Undertaker and to just have it as a bonus or a gift for the fans. And yes, it's a 2.5 minute squash, but similar to when they
It's
had
still a spectacle.
it's a spectacle, and similar to when they had The Rock beat Rowan of the Bray Wyatt family in 9 seconds or whatever it was. It's something that it's really smart of them when they do stuff like that to not advertise it, because and similar even when they had Austin versus Kevin Owens 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Don't advertise it. What it does is it builds goodwill with your audience, and those people that paid the money that year for WrestleMania, they're sure as hell going to come back the next year. And for the fans,
Because you can't predict who's going to show up and
exactly
what they're going to do.
right.
Uh,
And for the fans that didn't pay to watch it in lifetime, and they say, I was kind of on the fence with that WrestleMania, and then they find out you missed the Undertaker or you missed John Cena or The Rock or Austin wrestling, then you're kicking yourself in the butt. You might order the replay, or you might come
I'm
back
just
next
happy
year.
that I can say that my all-time favorite wrestler squashed John Cena on the stage that mattered the most. I know that's going to sound silly. I don't care, because to me, and I'm not going to get on a tangent with him, to me, John Cena, for the majority of his run, represented everything I didn't like about wrestling. The
Sure.
Undertaker represents everything I love about wrestling. So
Yeah.
to see The Undertaker go in there and absolutely annihilate him, I loved it. I have no shame in saying, anytime my friends reference that match, I say the same 3 words: he squashed him. And I'm sorry, this is where I become a fan again. I'm like, yes, you don't get to beat death. The Undertaker is death incarnate. And as far as I'm concerned, The Undertaker should still be undefeated at WrestleMania. To me, he should have never lost that streak. And if he was going to lose it, it should have been to the late, great Bray Wyatt. That's just me. Looking at Laz's comment, John Cena will be facing Roman soon. When will we see Rock versus Roman? To answer both your questions, hopefully never. And the
The
reason I say that to you, Laza, is simple. Roman Reigns has defeated The Undertaker, Brock Lesnar, Bill Goldberg, Triple H, Randy Orton, John Cena, Chris Jericho, Edge, and Daniel Bryan. To the best of my arithmetic, that's 9. To add The Rock to that list, what does that do for the business long term? It really doesn't do anything. And I'm going to pose a question to Mikey, and it's a very
Sure.
simple yes or no question. Was there a monumental gap in credibility between Austin and The Rock when they were at their peak? Was there a monumental gap in credibility between the two? Or were they
I
pretty much on equal footing?
I think Austin hit first, but it wasn't. It was maybe a year after Austin was at that upper level, maybe a
No, but
year and a half.
what I mean, Mikey, is was there ever a time where you felt that The Rock was where when once The Rock knew who he was,
Right.
did he ever look like he was completely insignificant compared to Austin?
No, and no,
Exactly.
I would say no,
Yeah.
no.
Same thing in the 80s. Savage didn't look insignificant compared to Hogan.
Right.
Undertaker, did the subject of conversation tonight, never looked insignificant compared to Austin. The biggest pay-per-view in WWF history was the Highway to Hell at MSG between Austin and the Undertaker.
Yep.
The Warrior didn't look insignificant compared to Hogan. Matter of fact, he beat Hogan clean. The point I'm trying to make to Laza, Roman Reigns, because of the way he's been booked, makes everyone else look completely insignificant. You have to lessen that gap. When a Kevin Owens wrestles a Steve Austin, it should not be a foregone conclusion he's going to lose. It shouldn't be a foregone conclusion that Roman's just going to beat all the big names and everyone else is left with scraps. There are plenty of guys The Rock could potentially work with and put over to make their careers. To the best of my knowledge, Roman Reigns has hit his peak. He will never be higher than what he is. So to waste The Rock on him is wasting a resource. You know, and I gave this analogy to my sister earlier today. It's like a 450-pound mammoth sitting at a table after he just had a 3-course meal. He's surrounded by a bunch of people that are skin and bones, and he's demanding the first serving. You
Right.
can't do that. You need to bring other people up to Roman's level. And here's how you don't do that: taking the last big name you have left and feeding that big name to him. When he's already had 9 others, how many big names has Kevin Owens beat? How many big names has Seth Rollins beat? How many big names has Gunther beat? I could go through all of these names. How many WrestleMania main events have all of these other guys had compared to Roman Reigns? You know, as much as he's public enemy number 1 these days, CM Punk was correct when he stated, how do you expect anyone to get better? You have to share the wealth,
Right.
as Dusty would say, if you will. You have to share the wealth.
Well, here's a little spontaneous booking going with what you just said, Jimmy. How about if they do a deal where Gunther wrestles and beats The Rock in a big, match, SummerSlam or whatever, and then after the match, The Rock offers his hand of respect. Gunther takes his hand, kicks The Rock below the belt. Gunther and his boys are giving The Rock, Imperium. They're beating up The Rock, and then the save is made by heel Roman Reigns, and Roman Reigns turns babyface to protect his defeated cousin, The Rock, and then you build up the Roman Reigns versus Gunther. And so I
It
would
all
say this.
depends on if the crowd is going to get behind Roman, because he
Oh,
doesn't
that,
have a good history as a babyface.
but
That's the
there,
thing. I
but
think
this is
Roman has found his niche, so to speak, as a heel. This isn't something I would be against, because I like the idea of taking someone like Gunther and giving him a big victory over a big name, because given his run with the Intercontinental Championship and the matches he's been cranking out with the likes of Sheamus, Chad Gable, Drew McIntyre, the guy's not having bad matches. And on top of that, he's making the middle of the card title feel extremely important, like it used to in the 80s. I honestly wouldn't be against that. And if the crowd is going to go along with Roman, then I'm fine with it. But if they're going to be booing him, I'm not with it. See, I'm more of go where the audience is taking you with the characters. But if they'd be willing to go along with that, I'm all for it.
Well,
I'm just not a fan of going against the grain. You know what
no,
I mean?
I hear you, but I'll give you an example, and it's the one of the. I guess we're getting a little bit off the topic of the Undertaker, but we'll get back to it before we wrap up. If you go back to 1986, the top of the year, Roddy Piper is going on his third year as the number one heel in wrestling, the number one heel in WWF.
Yes.
He's fighting Mr. T at WrestleMania 2. And then he takes an extended vacation to, I believe, film They Live, which came out a couple of years later. So
I had 1
Piper's
year to
taking a
chew bubble gum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubble gum.
right. So when he's off of TV for a while, off of WWF TV, Piper's Pit goes away because Piper's not there. So they start doing this thing called the Flower Shop with a controversial character at the time. They've taken
Adorable Adrian Adonis.
Right. They've taken our New York badass Adrian Adonis and the leather jacket, and they've made him adorable Adrian Adonis and the moo and the dress and the makeup and the flowers, and he's doing the flower shop. And only one person did the fans want to see stop the flower shop. It wasn't Hulk Hogan. It wasn't the Junkyard Dog. It wasn't Tito Santana or Ricky Steamboat or anybody else. There was only one person that the fans suddenly missed, and that was Hot Rod Rowdy Piper in Piper's Pit. And when Piper comes back and he sees that and they set it up very well. They gave Adonis Cowboy Bob Orton as Adonis's bodyguard because Orton was left high and dry with nothing to do when Piper took off because Orton was Piper's bodyguard in
Yes.
Piper's Pit. So as soon as they put Orton with Adonis, you know that when Piper comes
There was
back,
an immediate connection.
there's the immediate connection, and and this is how you make, in my opinion, as a fan, this is how you make a heel into a baby face. You have a worse heel for that heel to fight against. So in this scenario, back in '86, you got Piper, who's horrible, but then you've created adorable Adrian Adonis, who was a mid-card act before this transformation, and you make him the most hated guy in the WWF, and you get Piper, who was the most hated guy, to come back and fight with him. And I think that was just masterful booking.
Good double turn.
Yes, and I think there was something here, Jimmy, where 1985. Now, granted, this is Pro Wrestling Illustrated, so it's the fix is in with the voting, but Pro Wrestling Illustrated's most popular wrestler of the year for most hated wrestler of the year for 1985 was Roddy Piper. The most popular wrestler of the year for 1986 was Roddy Piper.
Wow.
So he went from the most hated to the most popular in 1 year, back when those awards meant something. And granted, the awards we know are now fixed, but they were a reflection of what people thought. So my point with Roman and the Gunther and the Rock in this fantasy booking is
it could work. It
absolutely
could work.
Because Gunther, granted, everyone likes his matches, but Gunther would be a better heel at this point than Roman. Roman's the good-looking guy. Roman's the good-looking guy with the nice body and the cool Game of Thrones things going. And the fans have bought into heel Roman, so they would love heel turns face Roman. Let's wrap up with the Undertaker. I think I veered you off track when we were talking about WrestleMania 25. You want to get back to that topic,
Yeah,
Jimmy?
Sure. That match was the match between Shawn Michaels and the Undertaker is a match that will withstand the test of time. They stole the show. They stole the year. Everyone was talking about that match all throughout the year, to the point where Shawn wanted the rematch for his retirement.
Right.
And it was sad to see Shawn Michaels retire, but it was at just the right time because he went out on top. He went out against his best opponent. And him and Taker had a good 2 matches. The first one I thought was better. Then Taker got hurt in the match where he beat Rey Mysterio to become a #1 challenger, and that's when the whole vegetative state storyline came in, where Taker put over Kane 3 times that you referenced, which ended with The Undertaker being buried alive again, and then he returned, and he was confronted by Triple H. Originally, that was for Sting. Sting had a WWE contract on his desk, a Hall of Fame induction, a DVD, and a match with The Undertaker at WrestleMania 27. And he went back to TNA to have a match with Jeff Hardy where Jeff Hardy was intoxicated.
Bad life decision.
I cannot begin to tell you the level of disappointment I have for that man, because that was the match I wanted to see from when I was 6 years old.
Yeah.
Sting was coming down from the rafters, beating the shit out of the NWO. Taker was coming out from a puff of smoke, choke slamming guys left and right. I wanted to see them fight. But we got a great match with Triple H with a really good ending where Taker, I thought that was the end when Triple H hit him with the tombstone. And Taker got him with the Hell's Gate submission hold. And then the year later, the Hell in a Cell match, which was the last truly amazing Hell in a Cell match, because that was a Hell in a Cell match in every sense, where it was an intense rivalry. The violence was present, which to me, regardless of the TV rating, when you're having a Hell in a Cell match, it's got to be a Hell in a Cell match.
Yeah.
And they delivered. Then the year later, I was actually at WrestleMania 29. And I got to see The Undertaker and CM Punk wrestle. Good match. Best match on the card. And then, unfortunately, a year later, the streak came to an end at the whim of Vince McMahon at the hands of Brock Lesnar. The match was horrible. The build-up was horrible outside of their first interaction with each other. And there was no payoff. That's what upset me the most with the Taker streak coming to an end. We got no payoff. There was no payoff for Brock. There was no payoff for Taker. We remember more of the fans' reaction to the moment than the moment itself. Then Taker had a meaningless match with Bray Wyatt where, by all intents and purposes, Undertaker should have lost. I have no shame in saying that. The streak was already gone. Bray needed to win. He didn't. And that continued his descent. The year later, he had a match with Shane McMahon in Hell in a Cell that nobody cared about outside of that bump off the top,
Right.
which is crass dummy crap. And then the year later, he wrestles Roman Reigns in the worst match I've ever seen in my life.
Bad hip.
I cannot convey, I don't think my words can convey how much I hated that whole match.
Yeah.
How much I hated the ending that we were given with Roman Reigns getting a pyro celebration after beating up an old man. And then Taker lays his gear in the ring. Me and my sister sitting together, tears in our eyes, believing this is the last time we're ever going to see The Undertaker. And he goes out like that. I was so angry. I was angry enough to the point where I did not watch WWE television for a year. The only reason I tuned in a year later was on SmackDown was because I heard Daniel Bryan was going to be coming out of retirement to wrestle AJ Styles. That was a match I wanted to see. When I heard that match was happening, I said I would. Well, I told my friends only one of two things will get me to come back: if Daniel Bryan comes back, or if The Undertaker is going to fight Sting. Those are the only two things that could bring me back. Outside of that, I don't want to hear about wrestling. I don't want to know about wrestling, because The Undertaker laid down for a guy that, in my humble opinion, is the most overpushed and overprotected guy in wrestling history. He was getting booed out of the building as the top babyface, and they didn't even have this. What turned me away for the year was the next night on Raw when he had all that heat, that mega heat, where the crowd was literally yelling 4-lettered words at this guy.
Right.
They easily could have made him the biggest villain since Mr. McMahon because he did something that the crowd hated. That's the essence of a heel. The essence of a heel is you're doing something that the audience hates. In this case, murdering the most respected pro wrestler since Andre the Giant. And he easily could have become the tribal chief right there and then. Even my dad, that was his last WrestleMania. That was his last WrestleMania because he hated that Bray got screwed in that match with Orton. He said they ruined Bray Wyatt. I can't watch anymore. And then he saw that they didn't turn Roman heel after he beat Undertaker. He said, I have no reason to watch anymore. This isn't the wrestling I grew up on. This is a sideshow. They don't protect their characters and they just do what they want. So that's why he walked away. I walked away after I said, okay, so we beat The Undertaker at WrestleMania a second time and we're going to get nothing out of it. When I saw that Roman didn't become a heel after that, I said, I can't do this anymore. I just couldn't. And I now have not watched weekly wrestling since then. Until that point, I was watching every show every week.
Right.
After that, no more NXT, no more Raw, no more SmackDown. And, I had to hear about him coming back to fight John Cena because I was not watching WrestleMania. I did not watch WrestleMania. I didn't watch WrestleMania 34. I did watch WrestleMania 35 because there was a lot of stuff happening that night that I wanted to see. The year after that was the COVID year.
Yes.
Where Taker had the Boneyard match because he missed the year before that. He didn't wrestle that night. Then he had the match with AJ Styles in the Boneyard, which unfortunately, a sad story coming from that is that while they were filming, the Undertaker had to learn that his brother had passed away.
Yes.
And the Undertaker had to deliver that news to his mother over the telephone. So that was, I can't imagine the sorrow and the pain that Mark Calaway was going through having to record that match knowing that his brother had passed away. I mean, just seeing my sister sick gets me upset.
Right.
I couldn't imagine having to do a performance like that knowing I can't be there for my mother or actually go to my siblings' services. So God bless him for being able to do it. My heart goes out to him for what he had to go through. And I thought he and AJ, for considering the circumstances they were in, for better or for worse, they delivered in their performance. And I am happy that the Undertaker chose to retire after that.
Yeah, I guess I'll wrap it up with this, buddy. And we'll do one more thing where we have our list of matches for people to watch. If you want to start thinking about that, some
Oh, I've got a
recommendations.
list already.
Okay, let me say that I think that the match with AJ Styles was a great way to go out. I think for me, the highlight, and I just before we did the Bray Wyatt tribute shows a month ago, I watched the Bray Wyatt John Cena thing, which I thought was very entertaining. That like kind of a "This Is Your Life in Hell" John Cena with Bray Wyatt. And if I'm not mistaken,
it was basically a character assassination, and I
yeah,
loved it.
yeah, and was the Boneyard match with AJ, was that the end of the first night or the end of the second night?
Yes, it was the end of the first night.
Okay, well, I considered that to be a great match. As far as the theatrical matches, now we all got to remember, this is COVID I mean, and I give WWE credit once again. I think
On the fly.
WrestleMania that year of 2020, it was supposed to happen in that big stadium in Tampa, the football stadium in Tampa. They weren't able to do that. WrestleMania was pre-taped for the first time from a soundstage. They didn't even have other wrestlers or college students in that small NXT venue. They had nobody beyond the crew there. And they did a WrestleMania, and granted, with the exception maybe of Charlotte Flair and Rhea Ripley and a couple of other matches, it was a tough WrestleMania to watch because it was so weird. But the two theatrical matches, I thought, stand up, and I think that the advantage, and yes, credit to Mark for getting through this because his one, I believe he had four brothers and a sister, so one of his brothers passed away uh, either right before they started taping or in the middle of it, and he couldn't even travel because there was no planes flying at that time. So I mean, you're right. I'm sure that as a performer, to some degree myself, sometimes you just have to compartmentalize things, and it's almost like you just gotta put it on hold, your emotions, and it's really hard to explain. But I think for Undertaker and AJ to do this match to the level that they did, I thought it was actually it kind of worked in that benefit because I think that with a live crowd, if Undertaker had to perform for a live crowd and then had the bad news about his brother's passing, it might have been a different story. And
Mm,
also, to be
never thought
fair,
of that.
yeah, with the theatrical presentation of AJ Styles versus the Undertaker, it was they could get a lot they could get a lot more into it, and I'm looking forward to watching that. One other thing I wanted to say is there's so many DVDs and there's so many WWE on Peacock or WWE Network shows that you can watch about the Undertaker. So many podcasts, Stone Cold and the Last Rides, 4-part documentary they did about the Undertaker. There's a DVD in my collection, Jimmy, that I gotta find it. It's the Undertaker. This is my yard, and I want to say 2004, 2005, but to me, maybe a little bit earlier. Maybe it was
It
2002.
was 2001 when that DVD came out, and the only
Well,
reason I know that is because I bought it.
yeah, and I have a copy around here somewhere. I got to dig through all my stuff and find it because on that DVD, for those of you that haven't seen it, to me, it was the first time that on an official WWF or WWE piece of programming, they broke the fourth wall with the Undertaker and Mark Callis, and they really dug deep into his history. And I still think that that's the best. Like of all the last rides and all the Stone Cold podcasts and all the different Undertaker stuff that we've seen, I still say that This Is My Yard is a great, I believe it's a 2 DVD set. One's
It
the
is.
documentary and one's the matches. I stand by that one. Jimmy, I'm going to let you take over the realm. I've got to take a little personal moment. Give me about 2 minutes. But while I'm gone, if you could tell people some suggestions for matches they should watch, I'll be right back, buddy.
No problem. I will get on that right away, Mikey. For anyone that's looking for some matches of The Undertaker to watch, there's plenty. The Royal Rumble 1994 casket match with Yokozuna. You absolutely want to see that. Their rematch at the Survivor Series 94, where Chuck Norris was the referee. That was another very good casket match. Any of his matches with Mankind from 1996, any of those matches are worth your time to watch. Um, the match he had with Bret Hart at Royal Rumble '96, excuse me. Um, excellent match. '97, the Fatal 4-Way that he had with Vader, Austin, and Bret before WrestleMania 13, very good match. The match he had with Mankind for the WWF title at Revenge of the Taker. Uh, both matches he had with Shawn Michaels in '97, the one from Ground Zero and the one from Bad Blood. The matches with Kane from '98, he had two of them. Uh, the match with Mankind and Hell in a Cell. If you haven't seen that, I'd be shocked. '99 really wasn't that good of a year for him in terms of his matches. 2000. In 2000, the Hell in a Cell match with Rikishi, Austin, Rock, Angle, and Triple H was pretty good. 2001 was another year where his matches really weren't that good. 2002, the match with Flair. You absolutely have to see that. Mikey talked about that earlier. The match with Flair is one you must see. The triple threat match that he had with The Rock and Kurt Angle that doesn't get enough love. The match with Brock Lesnar in the cell that Mikey talked about. 2003, he had a few. He had a TV match with Kurt Angle. That was a classic. 2004, just for the spectacle of it, his return with Paul Bear. No one saw that coming. The last Ride match with JBL was a slugfest. In 2005, his entire feud with Randy Orton, which covers most of the year. 2006, any of his matches with Mr. Kennedy. 07 and 08 are Edge and Batista. Definitely the No Way Out 2006 match with Kurt Angle. When you get Dusty Rhodes to go nuts, that's a match you must see. Another obscure match that most don't know about. I'm trying to do the less obvious ones, Mikey.
Sure. But you can
If
do
you
the
could
obvious one
find
too.
it, he had a last man standing match with the Great Khali on SmackDown in 06. That wasn't half bad. If you want spectacle, 92 SummerSlam at Wembley when he made his entrance on a hearse, which was sick. Let's see. Trying to think. His WrestleMania match with Mark Henry wasn't bad. Hit him with a tombstone pile driver, all 400 pounds of him.
WrestleMania 22 in Chicago.
Yes.
Yeah, casket match.
Yes. Any of his matches with Batista, including their Hell in a Cell match, was chef's kiss good up until the ending. I won't give it away. His Hell in a Cell match with Edge was a knockdown, drag out. And what I loved about the psychology of that match was that Edge realized he was all alone. He had no backup, and he descended into madness. And he decided that madness was his best weapon to combat the Deadman, because he couldn't outpower him. He couldn't outmaneuver him. He had to outpsych him. And the match was brutal. Edge, the crazy bastard, wanted to take a tombstone on top of the cell. And this was the new Hell in a Cell, the one that was extra big. There was no way Taker's old ass was getting up there. I love him to death. There's no way he's making it up there. His last man standing match with the Big Show from Cyber Sunday 08. Very good match. Probably Big Show's best match, gimmick-wise. His best bell-to-bell match, Big Show. Real fast, I'd have to say the match with Sheamus from Hell in a Cell 2012 for the heavyweight title, where he beat Sheamus. Excellent match for the Big Show. Let's see. For Taker, another good one. Shit. The Hell in a Cell match with Brock Lesnar from 2015 gets slept on, but that was brutal.
Yes.
And lastly, if you haven't watched it, the match with Punk at WrestleMania 29, probably Taker's last great match. Like in the ring. What he did with AJ was phenomenal.
Right.
No pun intended. But in the ring, that was Taker's last great match. The match with Punk. And Punk had a lot to do with that. I feel that that's as good a list as I could give. I just gave a list that spanned a 30-year career.
Off the top of your head.
Off the top of my head with
I
no
love it.
preparation. This is just me going off the fly, because you have to understand, for me, when it comes to pro wrestling, and this is how I'm going to end my part of this show.
Sure.
When it comes to pro wrestling, for me, The Undertaker is it.
Well, Jimmy, I love it, man. A great list, and then Laza really appreciates that list. Laza chimes in with the Inferno match. That, I believe, was in Greensboro, North Carolina, believe it or not. So some of these, I have a weird thing, Jimmy, where like the last 5 or 6 WrestleManias, I get them all mixed up in my head. But if we're talking about stuff from the 90s or the 80s or even parts of the 2000s, I can remember like the city and I do
You're very
remember.
good at that. You're good at memorizing where what arenas, what cities. You're good like that. That's where I fall short. I'm not good with that. I have to
Well,
work on
yeah. Here's the thing about that Kane versus Undertaker match, the Inferno match. It was in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is an arena I've actually been in as a fan, and because I went to college there in Greensboro at one point in my life. And the soundtrack to that pay-per-view was Sweet Home Alabama, which made very little sense because the show was out of North Carolina. So I can't remember if it was a payback or a no way out or whatever the actual pay-per-view was.
that.
That
That was
pay-per-view.
Unforgiven.
Okay, Unforgiven. I'm almost certain, Jimmy, that they had the theme song of Sweet Home Alabama, although the show was in North Carolina. So I guess in Vince's mind, just the South is the South.
I
I'm
suppose.
I'll give a list of some Undertaker matches. A lot of them I mentioned during the course of the show here, and my list will be significantly less than yours because I think you nailed it with all the best ones. But that Texas Red versus Bruiser Brody match, I mean, once again, just to nail it home, if you most wrestlers, Jimmy, if you wrestled Bruiser Brody, like that's your career highlight. I wrestled Bruiser Brody, like Al Snow wrestled Bruiser Brody in
Yeah.
a 2-on-1 handicap match and got jobbed out. But if your career starts by wrestling Bruiser Brody in match number one, and then things just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and some obstacles and some slow points, but for the most part, I mean, it's just amazing that he's gone from Bruiser Brody to AJ Styles and all points in between. That match I mentioned earlier of the new skyscrapers, Callis and Spivey against the Road Warriors, that
Yeah.
was a Clash of the Champions in November of '92. I'm not sure. It might have been November of '92. That would have been Clash of the Champions 9 New York Knockout in Albany, New York on the undercard of Flair Funk I Quit, if I'm getting all that straight. The next one I'd say is the Baltimore 1990 Great American Bash, which is actually a really great card from top to bottom, and Sting and Flair. And we'll have to get into this time sometime, Jimmy. But back then, even in the 90s, a lot of pay per views, especially with the NWA, they weren't main event, main event, main event. It was like you built up to the main event, and they had things like Brian Pillman versus, Buddy Landell on like the opening match of that card. And then you
Okay.
built up to Harley Race and Tommy Rich and eventually Luger and Mean Mark for the U.S. title. There's an obscure match somewhere on YouTube that I've seen. And this is not really spoken of. I don't think we even spoke about it tonight, but after he fell through with the NWA in 1990, he actually did a very brief return to Memphis, and it might have just been a one-off, but they had this big USWA title tournament, and it was one of those one-night, 20-man single elimination tournaments. They actually brought back Mean Mark to be in the tournament in late 1990, like maybe October of 1990. I think he just did it as a way to thank Jerry Lawler and thank everyone in Memphis before he went on to the WWF. You know what I mean? So it was kind of
That
like one of
sounds like
those.
something he would do.
Yeah. So it was one of those. It was kind of like a Steve Austin and ECW thing. So like Mean Mark actually comes back post NWA, post Skyscrapers, and pre Undertaker, and he wrestles Jerry Lawler in the tournament in Memphis. And it's on like I said, it's on YouTube. WrestleMania 18 against Flair. I don't know if you mentioned this one, Jimmy, in your list. You might have. The hardcore title match against Rob Van Dam. Did you
I did
mention that
not
one?
mention that match, and I should have.
Yeah, well, that was like, well, I got to say something too. That was like 2001. Was it 2001 or 2002?
That was December 2001. Vengeance.
Nice. So it's a pay per view match. It can be easily found. And this is what I think about that, Jimmy. And like I said, we could go all night, but that was like bringing legitimacy to the hardcore title. The fact that you basically had Raven with 17 title runs, you had Crash Holly, Hardcore Holly, Al Snow, guys fighting in the river. And then you kind of bring some legitimacy to the hardcore title for a while when the fucking Undertaker wants that title. And when he's beating a guy who's also quite good, Rob Van Dam. But when
That
the
he is.
Undertaker, yeah, the Undertaker says, this title's mine, and he takes it. And then he had this really kind of monster run with the hardcore title. And then he segues into having a monster run in early 2002 with the world title when he beats Hogan at that pay-per-view and so on and so forth. And I think this is when they were calling him Booger Red, like, which I thought was a really
That was
weird and
JR, and I don't even know what that means.
yeah, it's like a Texas thing. Like I think there was like a sports coach that had that nickname. It's a
Well,
pretty,
it's better than what they called him backstage, because
which was what?
according to Paul Bear, his nickname backstage was Wendy.
Oh my god, like the hamburger.
Yep,
Okay.
because there was a time where he had that really long red hair, which I guess that's not a bad name compared to Paul's. Paul's was Pooh Bear.
Oh god.
Naza just gave us a good match that neither of us have mentioned. The ladder match with Jeff Hardy.
I believe that was on a wasn't that on a Raw,
That
and
was
that's
the
what.
main event of a Raw.
And I if I'm not mistaken, Laza, I believe Undertaker was a heel world champion, but he was kind of a tweener. Like he was still like kind of just him, like kind of like
He
the
was beginning his turn back to goodness.
right. And so he like shook Jeff Hardy's hand after the match, type of deal.
Yeah, he
Uh,
raised his when Jeff kept getting up after Taker would beat the shit out of him.
yeah,
Taker eventually shook his head like you're one tough SOB, and he raised his arm. And Jeff, kind of surprised that that even happened, kind of fell over. And that, in many ways, was a making moment for Jeff Hardy. Unfortunately for him, he would soon depart WWE soon thereafter and not return until 2006.
yep. And then yeah, Jeff Hardy's another episode for another day. My buddy Morrow, I should give him credit. He's a huge Undertaker and Jeff Hardy fan. I agree with him on Undertaker. With Jeff Hardy, not so much. But then we go to we definitely talked about this one. Hell in a Cell '97 against Shawn Michaels.
Oh,
I I think that in a lot of ways, Jimmy, is the perfect wrestling match, especially of that era, because there
it
was
is.
no there was no title on the line. There was a number one contendership on the line. In a sense, that's the match that led right into the Montreal Screwjob because
It
Shawn
did.
won the match. Yep. And then not only did it's a perfect match in itself, but like you talked about so well earlier, this was the introduction of Kane, which is like the perfect debut. And it's also a thing where nobody looks particularly bad because even though
Yeah.
Mean Mark, the Undertaker loses the match, he's got the biggest yeah butt in the world. I just saw my dead brother, who I thought was dead for the last 20 years, just came out of hiding to
And dumped me on my head.
right. And then I don't know if we mentioned this one, but a lot of people, which is kind of weird with the WWE, Jimmy, I don't think that they, meaning the WWE, Vince McMahon, Michael Cole, and everybody else, I don't think they mentioned that when he was doing those back-to-back 2000s matches with Triple H at Mania, I don't think they even mentioned that they had the WrestleMania 17 match in 2001 at
They did
Mania.
not mention it at all,
Right.
which
Which
wasn't a bad match.
I think that match stole the show again. And Jimmy, I remember at the time people were saying that they thought that the Undertaker Triple H match was the best match of WrestleMania 17.
TLC 2 was a close second,
Yeah,
and
that's true.
Austin and Rock was until the ending.
Right. That's a good. Oh, Adam Demoyes checking in. Adam's a good guy. He's been on this channel. He actually did a
Right.
nice thing for me a few years ago. He went to one of Conrad Thompson's events, and he got me a giant bunch of swag, some really good stuff. I'm still working on the Young Bucks book, but I mean, he got me a bunch of autographs, Jeff Jarrett and stuff,
That was fine with him.
yeah, and Adam's a good guy. So we've been doing this for 2 hours and 23 minutes, guys. I guess we're gonna wrap up. Jimmy,
Yep.
any final words here, buddy?
Well, all I could really say is I enjoy being on this show. Me and you don't even prepare notes, and we went on for 2.5 hours, and it feels like it was only 10 minutes. Honestly,
Yeah, No, I mean, I was looking forward to this, buddy, and I'll open it up to you and to anybody, Laza or Adam, if you guys have any topics. I think what our sweet spot here is, wrestling for the last 20 years, the personalities. I do feel good about this one because, look, Jimmy, although he's the dead man, nobody lives forever. And I feel like it's nice that we can put our thoughts together in this tribute to the Undertaker. While who
While he's
knows,
still with
maybe
us.
while he's still with us, if there's any chance he ever finds his way to seeing this thing, if anyone watching this has access to Mark Ellis, feel free to forward it to him. I think we did.
Absolutely.
I think I'd like to let him know, like you said, and like what I liked about what you talked about at that live event with the thousands of people in line to meet him is it's interesting that some people are so humble, like a Mark Callis, that he doesn't fully appreciate. Oh my God, all these people come out for me. But it's like, no, man, like he brings a lot to the table, and that lock. And we didn't even talk about some of that insider stuff, like the wrestler's court, and all that stuff where the Undertaker was the judge, jury, and executioner of the WWF wrestlers court. It's just nuts. I mean, but like I keep harping on it, but just the fact that he's got Percy Pringle in his corner, the future Paul Bearer, wrestling Bruiser Brody, and then everything he went through, the skyscrapers, he was afraid that he was going to be the gobbledygooker because they brought him in the same night they brought in the gobbledygooker thing, and so just crazy. Pro wrestlers on the rise pre WWF would be a good topic. Example: The Undertaker and his Master of Pain. Yeah, I mean, we could talk
That's
about
fine.
guys.
There's several guys we could talk about. We could
Yeah.
talk about Steve Austin when he was in the Hollywood Blondes, or when he was feuding with Gentleman Chris Adams. We could talk about Shawn Michaels when him and Marty Jannetty were the Midnight Rockers, and they were feuding with the East-West Connection, which I believe was Jesse Ventura and adorable Adrian Adonis.
Not quite. The Rockers were feuding with Playboy Buddy Rose and Pretty Boy Doug Summers.
Oh, all right.
Yeah,
oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. The East-West Connection was feuding with the High Flyers, which was Jumpin' Jim Brunzell and Vern Gagne's son.
Greg. Yeah.
I had my history wrong there for a second.
Luckily,
I had Mike to untangle that for me.
Well, it's I mean, it's interesting, man, because I mean, the Killer Bees to me were always kind of this offshoot of the High Flyers because they both had Jim Brunzell on the team.
Yes.
In any event, man, we could be here for the whole weekend, but I'm going to let you go, Jimmy. I know you got a lot of stuff going on. I appreciate you being here, and the sound was great. We got the headsets, everybody, so we're sounding good, we're looking good, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. I put a bunch of shorts on this channel, One Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan. If you go over to the shorts, I did a 15-second tribute to the entire Wyatt, Mulligan, Wyndham family. I got all 5 guys in from the family in 15 seconds. I got Andre the Giant in Japan.
Check it out.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. And Jimmy, if there's anything else you want to say, go ahead, buddy.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to coming back.
Okay, we'll go see you next time, guys. Have a great weekend.